Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about What If Anger Deku had 𝐀𝐦 and Quirk Part 1. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see Part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝐸𝐸vritebutwhatever from 𝐸𝐸3. So let's start the video. Izuku Midoriya was an undoubtedly good person. He had been since the very moment he had been able to form conscious thought. He had a compulsion within him to do good. Many people would think that his goodness was caused by his mother's influence. And there was no denying that Midoriya was a wonderful woman. But it was more than that. His drive to help people was far too intense to simply be attributed to his upbringing. His urge to help people was in fact less a moral calling and more a deep-seated compulsion. So when Izuku decided that his life's ambition was to be a hero, it came as a surprise to exactly no one. He wanted to save people, just like All Might, even before he had seen the hero's debut video. Under normal circumstances, this would have been all fine and good. Most children wanted to be heroes at one point or another. Even before there had been quirks, people loved the idea of heroics. So with Izuku being how he was, it made perfect sense that his young heart would be set on heroics. There was only one problem. A few months after his 4th birthday, Izuku Midoriya was diagnosed as quirkless. Diagnosed as if he had a disease. As the quirk specialist had explained to the two shocked Midoriyas, his body had traded a quirk for an extra toe joint. The tone of the room at the time being as though Izuku had been diagnosed with cancer or some terrible ailment. The reveal of an extra toe joint sounded like a death knell, which in some ways it was. The reveal was nothing less than devastating. Before the doctor had told him point blank he would never get a quirk, Izuku hadn't even considered that he might not get an amazing quirk. Mostly because he thought every quirk was amazing in its own way. He would have been genuinely excited about any that he had developed. Up until this point, Izuku could often be found daydreaming about what sort of quirk he would get. He would be able to pull objects toward him like his mother, get his father's quirk, or even something completely different. It wouldn't have mattered to Izuku. Every quirk was amazing. Any quirk would help him be a great hero. But with the doctor's word, it was cemented into reality. Izuku would get none of the quirks he had dreamed of. Because this wasn't a world of childish wonder. This was the real world. And although Midoriya was ruled by his need to be kind, the world was under no such constraints. So a boy who wanted nothing in the world more than to be a hero was told that he never could be. From the very moment that the words had left the doctor's lips that Izuku wouldn't get a quirk, Izuku's life took a drastic turn for the worse. That night Izuku sat in the desk chair watching All Might's debut and crying. He knew what the doctor had said, but he still wanted to be a hero. When his mother saw him watching the video, he had asked her for reassurance. His tears blurred his mother's image as she fell to her knees before him, apologizing and crying all the while. This became the first incident in a long stream of events that seemed to be all trying to break the young boy. After all, how could he be a hero if his mother even thought it was impossible? The second incident was a lot worse, and with far more far-reaching consequences. That was when the person he thought to be his best friend forsook, and then tormented him, renaming him Deku, and seeming to lose any affection he'd held for Izuku in the span of one conversation. Some light of affection seemingly going out, replaced by a manic glee of superiority that didn't belong on a child's face. It even went so far that his old friend had begun to make sure that Izuku was socially ostracized and bullied. It hurt to have 𝐀𝐦 turn on him like that. But that was nothing compared to the fact that the world was screaming at him that he could never be a hero. Despite all of this, Midoriya Izuku was strong. This would come as a surprise to anyone who looked at him. He did not look like he was strong. Midoriya Izuku was a small child. He had big doe eyes, curled soft green hair, and a sweet-looking round freckled face. He was quick to cry, and most importantly, he was quirkless. But none of these things made him weak. And no matter what his ex-best friend said, it did not make him useless. Or at least that's what he kept telling himself. Bakugo, however, did think this made him useless, and for reasons Midoriya couldn't understand. It seemed that he'd made it his life's mission to make sure Izuku knew it. The way that Bakugo went about showing Izuku this was by bullying him mercilessly. To the point that whatever tiny amount of self-confidence the young boy had developed at 4.5 was systematically worn down to almost nothing. So Midoriya grew up nervous and abused with no friends to speak of. Any kids who didn't immediately get the message. or who Izuku tried to make friends with were discouraged away quickly. Bakugo was strong enough to make sure that interacting with Izuku just wasn't worth the trouble. If you were to ask Izuku what the worst part of all of this was though, he would probably say that it was how his name was erased. When he had first learned of his quirklessness, he had told his best friend, his 𝐻𝐿, looking desperately for comfort after his mother failed to reassure him. So he looked to the boy he had known practically since infancy. But any comfort or reassurances he might have expected were not what he received. Instead, he was mocked and rechristened. He was longer Midoriya Izuku. He was now simply Deku. An insult as well as a reminder of his place in the world. His new name was a constant reminder that he was quirkless, that he was powerless, that he would never save anyone. After a while, no one even seemed to know what his name was anymore. But the one constant about Izuku Midoriya was that he was nothing if not determined. So despite the bullying, he persisted. His main rebellion against his tormentors simply being alive in a world that didn't seem to want him. Although his real rebellion, the one he cared about, was the one in his heart. No matter how much he was told it was impossible, he held onto his dream of heroics with both hands. But even with the promises he made to himself, there wasn't much he could do being a quirkless boy. Although things were better than they used to be, there wasn't much he could do as a quirkless boy. But he was learning. He figured the first step to properly following his dreams was simply in living long enough to do so. And Midoriya Izuku was a quick learner. He learned quirks and heroes and villains. And more importantly, he learned how to survive in the battlefield that was Bakugo Katsuki. One of the most important things he learned was that although Bakugo was cruel, he wouldn't actually physically hurt Izuku so long as he stayed out of his way. Or at least what Bakugo perceived as his way. As long as Izuku followed the rules, he could, for the most part, stay safe. Unfortunately for Izuku, learning the complicated intricacies of staying out of Bakugo's way had come from nearly a decade of trial and error. And the fact that he now knew how to avoid his wrath did nothing to get rid of the burn marks that already littered his body. His whole left shoulder was just one large burn scar, from how often Bakugo would grab him, palms still burning. He also had a giant, somewhat hand-shaped scar on his back, as well as the dozens of smaller scars on his arms and legs. His once smooth brown skin, now littered with pink scar tissue. All gained before he learned that fear could keep him safe. Before he learned not to step between Bakugo and the other children. Although stepping in between fights was no longer a concern. At some point Bakugo had started to only go after Midoriya, figuring that Izuku would simply jump between him and his target anyways, so he might as well just go straight to Izuku. Soon enough, with Bakugo setting his sights on Yua, other than his treatment of Izuku and his general disposition, Bakugo was straight-laced as they come. Always in bed early, never outright breaking the rules, perfect grades. He had to be perfect if he wanted to get into Yua. The rest of the school, seeing Bakugo's example, also went after Izuku, making him the unofficial student body chew toy. At first Izuku had been glad that Bakugo didn't seem to target anybody else. But then the bullying had simply gone on, and relief faded away. Relief over protecting others turned into dread and fear. And as the years dragged on, Izuku Midoriya began to warp. He was still kind and strong and good at heart, but he became strong in a different way. His natural proclivity to rush into things head was squashed by too many harsh and bloody lessons. In learning how to avoid Bakugo's wrath, he couldn't simply act. He had to become more like the water. Learning how to flow around obstacles, to become hard to catch, and to not make ripples. He learned that it was better to be unseen, better to be meek. All this made his personality very slowly start to become distorted. A once confident and headstrong boy, becoming shy and unsure, acting in ways that went against his nature. And from this distortion was born a seed of resentment that grew at the very center of Midoriya's being. Izuku could feel it inside his chest sometimes, although it was as of yet to bloom into anything. It went against his very being to do anything outwardly cruel. But years of torment were getting to him, making him, if only on the inside, making him angry and analytical. But at least for the moment he was yet let his anger consume him. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to save people. Not just by beating up the bad guys, but by saving people's hearts. But knowing he didn't want to become a hateful person and not being angry were two very different things. And it was getting to the point that he was angry almost all of the time. Worse was that it seemed as though there was no outlet for it. So he did his best to ignore his mounting feelings of rage, and instead shoved them deep down within himself, unknowingly only watering that seed of resentment in his pursuit of his dreams, and hoping to have something to do to distract him from the thoughts in his head. Izuku spent most of his time working on his analysis books. They had started off with titles like Quirk Analysis for the Future. But one of the burns on his arm had put a stop to that, constantly reminding him of why he didn't want anyone to find out what he wrote about. Now they were all labeled things like algebra or world history, and written in code. Izuku wrote constantly. He wrote about the weaknesses of Bakugo's quirk, about the weaknesses of his personality. He even wrote about his classmates. Although he mostly wrote about heroes and villains. He wrote about how to beat them, and how to hurt them. He hadn't actually meant to write about the hero's weaknesses, but he couldn't help but look for them when he watched people. The part of his brain that had been hardwired through violence, looking for a way to slip through people's defenses. This meant he knew almost everyone's weaknesses, although exploiting them would be a completely different matter. And so it was on a day much like any other that found Izuku sat at his school desk, recording his thoughts on a fight that he had witnessed on his way to school earlier that morning. When he suddenly felt the disconcerting feeling of being watched. And Izuku suddenly realized he was no longer off the radar. Most days he was ignored by everyone outside of the occasional shove or harsh word. But today that wasn't the case. He had been so engrossed in his notes that he hadn't noticed anything was wrong until suddenly his normally overwhelmingly rambunctious class went quiet. Every eye in the room settling on him. Izuku looked up anxiously, seeing that Bakugo and everyone else in the class was staring straight at him. Bakugo standing on his desk frozen, as though he had been interrupted mid-rant, and with a look of what could only be defined as pure concentrated hatred pointed directly at Izuku. Suddenly Izuku was wishing he'd made a habit to pay attention to the classroom. Because as that painful moment of silence broke, it was replaced by everyone except Bakugo breaking out into uproarious taunting laughter. Izuku's mind worked double time to try and figure out what had gone wrong, and it was as he listened that he began to piece together what had happened. Everyone was mocking his goal of getting into 𝐬𝐬, which meant someone had told them he wanted to go there. His brain was overwhelmed with questions at this. How did they know? How did they find out I want to go to 𝐬𝐬? I haven't told anybody, so how do they know? It was in the split second before Bakugo jumped off his chair and began to storm toward him that Izuku got his answer. As he looked toward his teacher, some small part of him hoping that for the first time a teacher might actually try to help him, or maybe he'd explain what was going on. But looking into the middle-aged man's eyes, he realized there would be no help from him. Just before Izuku had completely zoned out, the man had been talking about careers, saying how they needed to start thinking about the future, which could only mean his teacher had told the whole class about his application to 𝐬𝐬, which meant he had been set up for this. Izuku was in shock at the realization, and as he stared at the man for a moment more, he saw behind his eyes that there seemed to be a spark of satisfaction. Apparently, Izuku thought with disdain, the students aren't the only people here who use me for entertainment. Before he could even properly process what he felt about this sudden new betrayal, Bakugo was upon him, fists setting off explosions, and anger permeating from him in waves that might have knocked Izuku down, even if he wasn't already currently being thrown into a wall. Izuku realized his mistake as he looked into Bakugo's eyes which were narrowed dangerously and burning with disdain. He hadn't acknowledged Bakugo fast enough, and he was already on the verge of a violent meltdown. And Izuku didn't want any more scars, so Izuku paid attention. His thoughts forcefully being redirected from the betrayal of his teacher, and to the explosive boy before him. "Deku," he growled out. "What the fuck do you think you're doing trying to get into 𝐬𝐬?" Bakugo growled, less of a question and more of a command. His anger apparent by how his fists were starting to burn the collar of Izuku's uniform. Izuku stared at Bakugo, and although Izuku was afraid, he found himself aware of just how close together they were. Their proximity making him think, for just a second, how wonderful it would be to lean forward and bite Bakugo's nose. He knew as soon as he entertained the thought that it would be infinitely satisfying. The human jaw was strong enough to bite off fingers, and he was sure if he bit hard enough it would leave a scar. But he held himself back. It's not like it would solve anything, and he was almost certain he would be the only one to face any kind of consequences. So he swallowed his almost non-existent pride and allowed himself to cower, barely having to try before those easy-to-come tears built in the corners of his eyes, which he purposefully widened as he looked up, taking a purposefully shaky breath before speaking. "𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐭 I swear I'm not trying to get into the hero course or anything. It's worth a shot, right? He allowed his stutter to take over to the point where he felt like he might almost be overselling it. But being confronted with Izuku's fear and distress, Bakugo seemed to calm down almost instantly. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked over Izuku before making up his mind. Don't apply for Deku. And just like that, he let go of Izuku's collar, letting him slump back against the wall. It was of course only at that point that the teacher decided to half-heartedly tell them to both get back to their seats. Izuku slowly walked back to his desk, setting it upright before sitting down and blinking away the tears he'd brought forth. He did his best to go back to writing in his journal, trying his best to ignore the few students who were still laughing at his expense and mocking his lack of a backbone. It was only when everyone went back to ignoring him, and the class regained a bit of normalcy, that he allowed himself to breathe a tiny sigh of relief, while also letting himself feel a small amount of the anger permeating his bones. He hadn't thought his teachers would actively try to put him in a situation like that. He'd done good damage control, all things considered. But this new information was disturbing, to say the least. He had always considered teachers to be neutral. They couldn't help you, but they also wouldn't hurt you. This changed things. After all, the only reason things with Bakugo had gotten as violent as it had was because he hadn't expected to be put on the spot like that, which meant he would need to rethink his approach to school. So he tweaks his strategy, but only slightly. After all, he already knew how to disarm the bomb that was Bakugo Katsuki. He even had the newest updated version written conveniently in his current notebook. This book simply labeled biology. The rules were simple, even if he didn't understand why they worked. They went as follows. Call him Kaken. A few years ago, when he had finally realized they weren't friends anymore, he had tried just calling him Bakugo, and it had seemed to enrage him more than usual. So Izuku called him Kaken. Izuku thought it might work because it was a reminder that they had once been friends, and made him feel the need to go easy on him. Or maybe Bakugo had gotten used to hearing the term of endearment, and suddenly not hearing it had confused him a little bit. But in any case, he used the nickname. The second thing he knew was that it was best to bite down on his pride. Standing up to Bakugo in any way only served to further enrage him. What Bakugo seemed to really want when he bullied Izuku was for him to be constantly conceding defeat. It was like each interaction, each word exchanged, was a battle of wills that Bakugo was determined to win. Izuku acting scared or submissive was him admitting defeat. Izuku's behavior was a continuously waving white flag. The third facet of Izuku's ongoing strategy was the one he most liked to ignore. Not acknowledging this strategy outside of when he employed it. It made him feel not only weak, but also dirty deep in his soul. It was that it helped if Izuku not only swallowed his pride and acted cowardly and weak, but if he did it in a way where he acted faint-hearted in a way that was somewhat beautiful. He couldn't simply let his tears run. He had to cry with large watery eyes and no snot. Or that when he shook or stuttered, he had to talk softly. When he was grabbed and threatened, he looked up. It all painted a picture. He would look up at Bakugo through his long eyelashes with his eyes that he knew could be beautiful in the light, body shaking just enough that you could see it, his tears like those of a feminine movie star. His voice would get high. It disgusted him to admit it, but acting helpless in a way that was attractive almost always made Bakugo back off. He wondered sometimes if it was because it made him seem like a damsel in distress. When they had been little, they had often played knights and damsels. Bakugo had always wanted to kill the dragon and save the damsel. Although later it had been playing the hero and saving the civilian, the game stayed the same. This damsel was mostly played by Izuku, and the rules for that had been similar to the rules he followed now. Cry for help, act hopeless, and be pretty, although in the past that had involved wearing a towel as a dress. Sometimes Izuku wondered if he mentioned the similarity to Bakugo if he would realize that he wasn't the hero, but the dragon. All the rules Izuku followed, and had learned, made him sick. Each time he batted his eyes, or tripped over himself to get out of Bakugo's way, he could feel white-hot rage tightening in his chest. But despite the psychological effects these interactions had on him, the fact remained that they kept him physically unharmed, even if they left him psychologically and emotionally frayed. Even now, just sitting in class, he could feel his vision going red as he tried to keep his face looking blank and disinterested. But no matter how hard he tried to shove it down, he couldn't seem to school his features properly. So he let his face rest on his arms, and not for the first time he thought about revenge. He thought about how satisfying it would have been to allow himself the satisfaction of biting 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜's nose. Especially the look that would have crossed his face when it happened. The fear and shock that would, however, temporarily grace the blonde's features. He thought about how 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 made every interaction into a sick battle of wills, and what it would be like to win for once. He thought about his teacher, and how much he hated that the man had purposefully put him into a position where he knew that he would be facing 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜's wrath. And he thought about his classmates taunting. Those idiots who had such useless quirks and still thought they were better than him. One of his classmates had a quirk that could stretch out his fingers. Big deal. What about that power made them better than Izuku? Why should that make it so he got to look down on him? So Midoriya spent the rest of his class period sitting there and seething, only moving when the bell was a few minutes away. As Izuku collected his things into himself, he also collected himself, turning it all off. Izuku wanted to be a hero, and heroes shouldn't be spiteful. Or at least heroes like All Might weren't, and that's the kind of hero he wanted to be. So he started his internal countdown, and then all at once he forced himself to stop. Stop thinking about revenge and petty hatred and move on. He wasn't a bad person. He wanted to be a hero. He wanted to save people. He wanted to do good. And he didn't think a hero would be entertaining such evil thoughts. At a minute before the bell rung, Izuku had his things packed and was ready to go home. He had learned that it was safer to get out of the classroom as quickly as possible, not only for himself, but also for his things. That lesson, like every lesson he'd learned, had been learned the hard way. But once again, the universe was not on his side, and 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 was already standing in front of him when he got up to leave as the bell rang. Izuku looked nervously around and saw that, as usual, no one was paying him any mind. The teacher was already gone, not that he could depend on him, and the only other people even looking at him were some of 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜's lackeys. Soon enough the room was completely empty except for them. 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 stepped forward threateningly and Izuku stepped back. Deku. 𝐀𝐦. He avoids eye contact, but allowed himself to wring his hands. 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 sighs and then leans in closer. You know I can't let you apply for UA. I'm gonna be the #1 hero. And every hero needs a great backstory. Mine is gonna be that I was the only one to make it from this shithole school. His expression morphs as he speaks from simply serious to murderously intense as he leans toward Izuku. Got it? He puts his hand on Izuku's shoulder. His hand is too hot. Izuku nods but keeps his eyes down. And soon the hand is retracted. 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 and his lackeys start walking out. But before he leaves, 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 looks back one more time and says the words that will stick with Izuku for the rest of his life. You know, if you really want to be a hero so badly, then I have an idea for you. 𝐾𝐦 smiles at him in an almost friendly way, as though he actually just wanted to give him advice. Why don't you go jump off the roof and hope for a quirk in your next life? 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 seems to wait for a moment before actually leaving this time, probably expecting some sort of reaction. But Izuku just stares out the window trying to keep himself together. And it is in that moment, for the first time in his life, that Izuku doesn't give a single solitary shit about what a hero should do. He's far too busy being overwhelmed by pure, unadulterated hatred that burns through his very core. There is no room for anything else inside of him, as the seed inside of him blooms into hatred and bloodlust. All he wants is to murder 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 and maybe piss on his grave. He wants nothing more than to end any chance of being a hero 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜 has. Izuku doesn't want to be a hero. He wants to be a blight on 𝐵𝑃𝑃𝐻𝑢𝑔𝑜. It takes a few minutes before Izuku manages to rein in his emotions enough to stop shaking and actually think clearly enough to move from where he stands without destroying something in a murderous rage, and begins his walk home. Of course, with Izuku having the general feeling that his day couldn't get any worse, and also being distracted by the fact that he's realized he wants something very different for himself than he thought he did. That his day gets a lot worse. His walk being interrupted as he is attacked by a villain who bursts from the sewers. He has no time to do anything before he is enveloped in a disgusting substance, and the air is being squeezed out of his lungs. Just when it seems like he was going to die alone, and then be worn as a meat suit, he meets All Might. Actually, he doesn't really meet All Might right away. For a moment, he's far too busy being unconscious, and then he was far too busy coughing up slime. But then he had been ecstatic. And then before he really has a handle on the situation, he's hanging on to All Might's pant leg for dear life. It almost seems worth it all as he stands there on the rooftop in the presence of his greatest hero. He is so hopeful for a moment that the darkness that had temporarily held complete sway over his heart dissipates, leaving him filled with hope. It doesn't last, however, as All Might, who in a shocking turn of events turned out to be a mere whisper of himself, tells Izuku the same thing that everyone had been telling him since he was 4, and promptly crushed his dreams. You can't be a hero. Those words ring through his mind like a death knell, drowning out all others as they ring through his mind over and over, his head replaying them constantly as he finds his way back down to the street. And then yet another unthinkable thing happens. Bakugo Katsuki is enveloped in the very same slime villain who had almost taken his life. And Bakugo Katsuki is dying. The great undefeatable Bakugo, the person he had placed on a pedestal next to All Might in terms of strength, was being killed by the very villain who had almost claimed Izuku's life only minutes ago. It made no sense. All Might had captured the villain, hadn't he? But then Izuku had grabbed All Might. Izuku stands there for a moment too stunned to do anything except take in the scene around him. Not only was Bakugo dying, but the heroes were doing nothing to save him, outright admitting that they were waiting for someone with a more suitable quirk to arrive and save the day. And there, standing on the other side of the crowd, having not noticed him yet, was the emaciated form of the man who had been only a few minutes ago been Izuku's whole world. All Might. As Izuku took it all in, he was suddenly filled with delight, not just because Bakugo was struggling, which did bring him an inordinate amount of satisfaction. No, Izuku was overjoyed because he had a plan. Almost as if sensing his presence, Bakugo looked out on the crowd desperately, their eyes somehow meeting through the crowd. When Izuku sees the look of fear and desperation in Bakugo's eyes, he feels himself break into a smile. He smiled so wide it hurt, so wide he could almost feel his skin wanting to rip on the edges. He smiled because even if his plan didn't end well, for the first time in his miserable life, he was going to win. He dashed forward, knocking his way through the crowd of onlookers, all the while smiling straight at Bakugo. It was shockingly easy to get past the heroes, and Izuku kept running all the way until he reached the sludge villain. Everything was going perfectly so far. The villain hadn't even noticed him yet, too busy focusing on Bakugo and avoiding his explosions. It's practically child's play for Izuku to enact his fairly simple plan. As he reaches the villain, he jumps straight up, jamming his hand into its sludge, and grabbed it by what he thought should be the weak point, its massive eye. The thing howls in pain when his hand made contact with the muscles that held its eye in place, and Izuku held tightly onto it in response, giving a harsh pull to what was one of its only body parts that could be damaged. Reacting blindly to the pain, the villain jerked and flung both him and Bakugo away. But what the villain and even Izuku himself hadn't planned on was the fact that Izuku hung on as he was thrown. And so as he was thrown away like a rag doll, the whole weight of his body pulled on the eye, wrenching the cord that attached it to the villain until it snapped. The villain screamed again, even louder this time, lashing out with long viscous tentacles that tried to knock everything away from its injured body. Izuku cautiously stood up, noticing that it had actually thrown him and Bakugo out of range of its own attack. A small stroke of luck, he supposed, as he watched the tentacles break through a piece of a building. He looked down on himself, a bit bruised, but otherwise almost none the worse for wear. Izuku watched on for a moment, not noticing that he was still holding the villain's eye in his hand, as the heroes finally got their shit together and started to mobilize. Although things were ended in an instant as a great smash rang through the air that sent the villain scattering for the second time that day. All Might was standing there victorious as rain began to fall upon the scene, the other heroes getting to work cleaning up the villain. Izuku then realized that it was over. He had saved Bakugo. And for the second time that day his grin widened, and he looked over at the still-winded Bakugo, both of them knowing exactly what this meant. Standing there bruised and worn, covered in blood and slime, and still holding the villain's eye in one hand, Izuku had won. Bakugo had been captured by a villain and almost died. That enough would be enough to wound his pride. But then he'd been saved by Izuku. It was the first time that he had participated in the game they played, and he had won. Bakugo's sick sense of pride would be grievously injured for a long time yet. They stayed like that for the moment, just staring at each other intently before the heroes and emergency service surrounded them. Bakugo kneeling on the ground with a look of shock, and Izuku standing tall with a deranged sense of triumph. As the medics start to try and lead them away, Izuku looked at Bakugo and speaks in a voice that is purposefully mockingly saccharine. "Hey Kaken, are you feeling all right? I thought you were gonna die for a minute there." Bakugo looks at him blankly for a moment before his features are engulfed by rage. But before he can properly respond, he finds himself too busy throwing up whatever sludge had wormed its way down his throat. And even after Bakugo finished throwing up, there was no time for an exchange of words as they were surrounded by heroes. Both of them huddled in shock blankets. Although for reasons he couldn't fathom, it almost seemed that the heroes were a bit weary of Izuku. A fact which he finds confusing until he later realizes that it was probably because he'd torn a man's eye out while smiling. All weariness fades, however, when it comes out that he is quirkless, which he finds infuriating, as though it somehow invalidates what he had done. The hero's tones quickly go from impressed and weary to disappointed and nagging. So he spends the next few minutes being chewed out by the heroes, while Bakugo is praised for his strong quirk. But they are both eventually sent home, which Izuku figured was good since he was feeling ready to snap. On his way home, Izuku thinks about what had happened, and he realizes that although he had temporarily felt better at first when he met All Might, and then when he won against the villain and Bakugo, he is still filled with rage to a degree that he has never experienced before. Worse, it is the kind of anger that demands action. He has broad goals, and as he thinks on it, he realizes he also has a general feeling of what he wants, but no clear plan. But even despite that, he almost relishes in his rage. It had let him attack that villain, had let him look down on Bakugo, however temporarily. It had made him, at least for a moment, stand on top of the world. And it is in that moment that Midoriya Izuku makes a decision. He decides that he is going to embrace the anger, and he is going to win. He is going to prove everybody wrong. He is going to make everyone who ever looked down on him eat their words. And it is just as he is making that decision that Bakugo walks into his path. He looks worse for wear. There are some bandages from where he was thrown, and his clothes are singed and ripped, and he still looks like he might still need to puke a bit. But none of his physical ailments seem to matter to Bakugo, who looks absolutely furious before grabbing Izuku for the third time that day by the collar and letting off explosions with his other hand, shoving him against a nearby wall. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" he roars into Izuku's face, explosions still going off close enough to his face that he can feel the heat singeing his curls. "I don't need saving from a quirkless nobody like you." He lets go, probably expecting Izuku to agree with him or cower. But Izuku has had enough of that. He keeps his head down for a moment, fighting back the smile that's worming his way onto his face, and trying to school his features how he wants them. And so the face that looks up at Bakugo is one with wide shining eyes with a shaky, genuine-looking smile. He takes hold of the hand that holds him against the wall, and makes his smile wider. "It's just that you looked like you needed saving." Bakugo freezes, staring at Midoriya in disbelief before turning on his heel and stalking away. It is in that moment, when Izuku is having his second victory in what was overall a very shitty day, that another previously thought impossible thing happens. All Might shows up again. And what's more, he apologizes. He says he was wrong. Izuku doesn't have to fake the happy tears that spring into his eyes, and for a moment he thinks everything will be okay. But then, like with every good thing in his life, there is a twist. All Might wants to give him his quirk. He wants Izuku to be his successor. Izuku's heart breaks again, because it means All Might doesn't think Izuku Midoriya could be a hero. He thinks that Izuku Midoriya could be a vessel for a quirk. So it is with a broken heart and a steadily burning rage that he accepts the offer. No matter how heartbroken he is, he will never turn down an offer for power. And it is then, crying on an empty street in front of his ex-idol, that he is forced to reconcile the fact that if this hadn't happened, he could never become a hero. But Izuku will take this power that is being offered to him, and he will become a hero. And he will make everyone eat their words. And if he ruins a few lives in the process, that will just be the cherry on top. Well, actually, the whole hero thing is the cherry at this point. Izuku Midoriya is nothing if not determined. And so as soon as he agreed to inherit All Might's quirk, he knew he would follow it through to the end, even if it killed him. Unfortunately for him at the moment, it felt like once again, the universe might have taken him a bit too seriously. Because it really felt like this might actually be going to kill him. Well, not actually kill him, just make him exhausted and in pain, so he felt like he was going to die. Or at least wanted to die a little bit. His determination doing nothing to stop the aching of his body during his training sessions. So he simply resigned himself to the fact that this was his new way of existence. He would just to be in a constant state of fatigue and misery. Not that he hadn't expected this. Even just looking over the training plan with All Might had made him tired. Although actually going through with it was something else altogether. He was bone tired. And at least part of it was his own fault. See, he wasn't actually following the training plan. In his defense, All Might had straight up told him that the quirk he would be inheriting could very well cause his limbs to explode if he was given before he was ready. And really, what the fuck? My arms would explode. After that unfortunate news, because nothing could ever be easy, Izuku had decided that he would be upping his training routine. No way was he leaving anything up to chance. So he followed the routine he had come up with, which was really just a more intense version of the all-American dream plan. And what kind of name was that? Starting effective immediately, Izuku's routine became this: running in the morning, eating breakfast, walking to school instead of taking the train, going to classes, cleaning up the beach, having dinner, studying, lifting weights, and then going for a second run, all before finally passing out. All of which left him with exactly no free time, and a body that was literally aching and exhausted every moment of every day. But Izuku was nothing if not thorough. He would never just half-assedly increase his training if he wasn't absolutely sure about what he was doing. It was only after he had conducted an insane amount of research and had basically figured out the maximum amount that he could do, while not hurting himself, that he even thought about deviating from the schedule All Might had given him. All Might, for his part, had no idea that Izuku was, in a very All Might fashion, going plus ultra with his training. Izuku had decided he would follow this path through to the end. And annoying as it was, part of that was determined on his behavior. Something within him had shattered that day. When he had been betrayed by a teacher, told to kill himself, found triumph, and told twice by his idol in different ways that he couldn't be a hero. It had been like reliving the day he had been diagnosed as quirkless. His mother had even cried and hugged him when he told her that he had been caught up in a villain attack. All of this had resulted in a transformation. He was no longer the soft-hearted boy he once had been. He was a machine that ran on pure concentrated rage. That wasn't to say he wasn't going to be a hero. His reasons for doing so had simply changed. He no longer wanted to save just anybody. He wanted to save the weak, and more than that, he wanted to crush the strong. When he really focused on what he wanted, he realized that he wanted to destroy society and reshape it. But even more important than his grand ambitions was that he wanted to make Bakugo eat his words and then take a swan dive off a roof. That was the thing that got him through his training. It was the thought that soothed his aching muscles and kept his mind sharp as he studied. If he could just ruin Bakugo, then he could say it was all worth it. When it came to All Might, he couldn't very well say any of that though. All Might had after all picked him specifically because he thought Izuku Midoriya was a selfless boy who valued others' lives above his own. He thought Izuku was still the boy that he had originally saved from the slime villain. The boy who had burned not by the flames of unstoppable rage, but with an altruism and genuine need to save people. Which he no longer was. This was the Izuku who had ripped a villain's eye out of their skull and taken his first spiteful win against his childhood bully. He was the Izuku who had hatched from the seed of hatred that had lain dormant inside of himself. But that didn't mean he didn't know how to act like he used to be. In fact, thinking back on it, he might have actually always been this Izuku. His anger went deep. This was simply him realizing the form of his character after it had been warped. So keeping up the act of hero-worshipping Izuku Midoriya was as easy as slipping on a mask. All Might was far easier to manipulate than Bakugo had been at the beginning. He had always had a serious case of hero worship, so it wasn't hard to bring the stars into his eyes when he looked at the man. It wasn't hard to act timid. It wasn't hard to act the part of the determined little fanboy. It wasn't hard to say what All Might expected him to. It wasn't hard to push down the rage. It was easy as breathing at this point. Bakugo had made a liar out of him. Because goddammit, he was getting that quirk. He was going to take it with both hands. And then he was going to tell the world, I am here. And then he was going to destroy it and make something out of the ashes. The only thing that really weighed on his mind in all of this was Bakugo. Lifelong habits had drilled it into him that he should always pay attention to the boy. But he'd had been acting strange. He didn't regret saving the Bakugo's life. Not when it had given him his first real victory, and had made All Might want him as a successor. Well, that, and he wanted to kill the Bakugo himself. But still the change in his behavior was weighing on him. Bakugo was, for the first time in their lives, leaving him alone. Which was especially odd because even before he had become his self-appointed tormentor, Bakugo had always been by his side. Their mothers were best friends from high school, and they had been practically raised together. Even with the tension between them, they still called the other one's mother's auntie. But after the slime villain incident, it was like Bakugo didn't even know he was there. Well, that wasn't entirely accurate. The only times that Bakugo wasn't ignoring him was when he would catch him staring with an unreadable expression before looking away again. And although he appreciated the peace and quiet, the behavior was too odd for him to relax. It made him want to confront Bakugo. But at the moment, he really didn't have time to deal with Bakugo's bullshit, so he ignored it. So for almost the entirety of his last year of middle school, Izuku lived and breathed his training schedule. And he cleared his goals in amazing leaps and bounds. Things were going as well as could be expected. He was becoming stronger, and had even developed a large amount of muscle. Or a lot of muscle for a boy of his size, who had started off like a stick bug. All Might had even said that he was impressed by his progress, which he found exceptionally pleasing. Unfortunately, despite his amazing progress, he was still a quirkless kid who was at the whims of All Might when it came to the passing on of his quirk. And even though Izuku had blown All Might's expectations out of the water, and was just a hair's breadth away from having completely cleaned the beach, the man had still not passed on his quirk. And at this point, although he hid it, he was getting more than a little impatient. Of course, he had started off impatient. When All Might had first said he couldn't immediately give him his quirk, he had almost lost it. But he knew he would have to be patient. But now he was only a week away from the UA entrance exam, and he needed the quirk to pass. There was simply no way that he could master the man's quirk in that amount of time. That was the reason that children had to go to quirk counseling, because it takes time to master your power without hurting yourself and others. But he could do nothing about it. All Might knew him as an All Might worshipping fanboy. He had made sure of it. After all, most of the time he spent with the man was spent carefully arranging the stars in his eyes when he looked up at him. And he'd so much energy into putting forward a hero-worshipping front. Which meant he had basically dug himself into a very shitty hole. There was no way anybody who acted as worshipful toward All Might as he had been acting would ever question the man, let alone demand he hand over his quirk. If Izuku were to suddenly start questioning the man, he could ruin all the hard work he had put into this whole thing. So he kept his mouth shut all the way until the day of the exam, when unprompted All Might gave him a shitty speech about progress, and had told him to eat his hair. At first Izuku had thought it was a horrible joke, being trained only to find out All Might had been yanking his chain. But of course All Might was 100% serious. So Izuku ate the hair, and cried what looked like happy tears when All Might told about how proud he was. He even managed to keep his incredulousness to a minimum before All Might explained why eating the hair was necessary. Eating All Might's hair had been, as expected, disgusting. Having been rushed off to school with only an ominous warning about possible backlash had been annoying. Getting to UA with no idea how to use an absolutely earth-shattering quirk, or even when he would be able to use it, was infuriating. And so even though it had been his dream to go to UA ever since he knew of the school's existence, Izuku Midoriya walked onto the campus of UA in more than a little bit of a shit mood. Actually, scratch that. He walked onto the campus of UA feeling like he wanted to murder someone and bathe in their blood. He just couldn't get over it. Was clench your butt and scream with your heart. Seriously, all the man could tell him about how to use the quirk he needed to pass the exam. Was that all the teacherly advice he could impart on the boy who was supposed to be his successor? What kind of fucking world did they live in that kind of half-assed person could be the #1 hero? He had been hoping for more than that from the #1 hero. It just went to prove that there was something deeply broken about the world they lived in. But there was nothing he could do about any of that at the moment. This was the real world, and what Izuku wished would happen didn't really matter all that much. It didn't matter that he wished he knew how to use his quirk, or that he wished his teacher had actually been helpful. The fact was that he had been vague advice, and an ominous warning that he was a barely suitable vessel, and then sent on his merry way. Which meant he was going into one of the most important events of his life, with a volatile quirk he didn't know how to use, and also jack and shit. And right on cue, there was the cherry on top. Bakugo showing up seemingly out of nowhere just to physically shove him aside and say something mildly threatening before stalking into the gymnasium. Izuku following equally, but not as obviously angry behind him. The amount of anger he felt boiling under his skin made him wonder if you could pass an exam on concentrated hatred alone. And if he had been hoping for a reprieve, he would not be getting one, because of course he was seated next to Bakugo. The universe just wouldn't seem to give him a break. Although Bakugo seemed just as happy to ignore each other as Izuku was. So although the instructions had been interrupted by some stuck-up kid, he had gotten through the instructions without any hiccups. Well, as okay as he could be considering that they were fighting giant robots. The thing Izuku was basically the least prepared to do. After which everything passed by in a blur. Izuku barely had time to consider his imminent doom before it was time to begin the test. The only thought running through his head as he ran through the fake city being, are they for real with this? First of all, he had no idea how a school, even UA, could possibly afford to build giant fake cities like this simply for an exam. Secondly, the robots they were fighting were huge and seemingly programmed to try and take out students with deadly force. And within the first minute of the exam, he had almost been killed about 3 times. The worst part of it all was that while Izuku ran around like a chicken without a head for the first half of the exam, he saw everyone else racking up huge amounts of points. One boy he passed by was already at 48. It was only by a stroke of luck that Izuku was able to get any points at all, because apparently the robots' guns still worked after they were detached. Of course, even that discovery had almost gotten him killed. But he supposed it was worth it to have a giant laser beam gun thing to take out other robots with. And as Izuku lugged the giant metal appendage around, one thing was for sure, and that he was thankful that so much of his training had been dragging giant things across a beach. Because the thing weighed a ton, and he was sure he wouldn't be able to lift it otherwise. But it still wasn't enough. There was only a minute of time left, and he had only scored a measly 7 points. There was no way in hell that was enough. And short of a miracle, he had no idea how he could make it in. And to make matters worse, there was a strange sensation traveling through his body that he was almost sure was one for all, which was kind of throwing him off his already not very good game. And then, as the things in Izuku's life tend to do, everything got worse. The ground began to shake. Izuku looked toward the source and saw a building crumbling under a great monstrosity of metal. And the source of the destruction was a robot as tall as a 20-story building, and on its front was a giant red 0. It was only when a giant piece of rubble almost fell on Izuku's head that he realized he should probably start running away. But before he could fully join the rest of his would-be classmates in their stampede away from the giant robot, he heard something. Help me. Please, someone help me." And he paused. There, buried beneath a giant piece of what used to be the wall of a building, was a girl. She was lying trapped on her stomach, one arm desperately reaching out, eyes pleading as the giant robot got closer and closer to flattening her. Izuku stopped, and then for the first time in a while, he remembered why he had wanted to be a hero in the first place. His mind flashed back to a video he had watched constantly as a child, All Might's debut. The time he had saved over 100 people. Izuku had wanted to be the hero who saved people from despair. And for the first time, Izuku's body moved on its own as he ran towards the girl. By the time he got closer, they only had seconds before the 0-pointer would land on both their heads. But there was no way that he would be able to lift the piece of rubble up and get her out before the 0-pointer killed them. And even if he had time, he wasn't sure if he could even lift the rubble. It was a miracle that the girl was trapped and already dead. So he jumped, and then he was suddenly even with the robot's face, and he punched it with all of his strength. And he kind of got what it meant to scream with your heart. The behemoth shattered as his fist made contact. And for a split moment, he was ecstatic he had saved her. They had told him he couldn't be a hero, but he had just saved someone. And then his body caught up with his heart, and Midoriya Izuku screamed. Somehow, in jumping up and shattering the robot, he had also shattered all but one of his limbs. And he could feel every break and tear. And then he looked down and realized how high he was, which was immediately followed by another realization. He was going to die. Any and all happiness he felt in that moment vanished, and he wished he had ran the other way. He wished he had given All Might the finger and told him to fuck right off. He wished he had never seen the girl crushed beneath the rubble. He wished he had left her behind and run out of the exam and out of the school and away from everything. Because the ground was coming too quickly for anybody to save him. There was nothing to do in the face of his imminent doom, and he was in more pain than he had ever experienced. And so as Midoriya Izuku plummeted to his death, his broken limbs flapping behind him, Midoriya Izuku screamed. But then a miracle occurred, or at least what felt like one to his pain-addled mind. Moments before he hit the earth and became a stain on the ground, there was the girl he had saved, smacking him across the face. Gravity stopped working on him, and it was unspeakably painful when his limbs suddenly jerked at his stop. But he was alive. But before he could revel in his being saved, he hit the ground. And when he felt the bones in his arm and legs crack, As his ragdoll limbs hit the ground, the pain was so intense, he almost wished he hadn't been saved. So without further thought, he resumed his blood-curdling shriek, and he kept screaming until his body could no longer stand the pain of consciousness. And then he passed out on the ground. The girl who had saved him puking on the ground next to him, her own legs fractured from pulling herself out of the rubble that had crushed her. The other students of the exam look on in horror and shock at the two students who had just almost died pass out, their bodies lying still and bloody on the ground, no one quite knowing what to do. People weren't supposed to get this hurt during an exam. But before any real panic could set in, there was Recovery Girl, who calmly took charge of the situation, her unhurried and calm demeanor granting the prospective students some measure of relief simply from her presence. The youthful heroine tutted disapprovingly as she looked at the shattered boy on the ground in front of her before kissing him on the forehead. She watched carefully as his limbs slowly knit themselves back together. This one would have to be carried to the nurse's office. Recovery Girl allowed herself a small sigh before also healing the girl's legs, the girl immediately rousing while the boy remained unconscious. So many injured children. It was just plain irresponsible. Even with the miracle that was her quirk, that boy would be sore for a few days. And if she wasn't there, well, she didn't even want to think about the state he would be in. Izuku woke up suddenly and immediately realized that he felt like he had been hit by a truck, and even more alarmingly, had no idea where he was. Needless to say, this caused him to very quickly become very alert and afraid. But then Recovery Girl hobbled up to him and offered him a handful of gummy bears, and his memory of the day's events came crashing back to him, causing him to suddenly remember what had happened. He remembered not getting enough points, and the 0-pointer, and his limbs shattering, and the girl's strained face as she saved his life. And upon remembering what had happened during his exam, he felt a dark cloud settle over his heart, the kind that spelled despair. His body still wasn't a sufficient vessel. The quirk that was supposed to help him conquer the world was a liability that had broken him. And oh shoot, Recovery Girl had been talking to him. He shook his head a bit before asking her to repeat herself, after of course acting suitably starstruck. Not that it was much of a stretch, she was one of the few heroes he still respected. She tutted at him a bit, seemingly amused by his admiration, before holding out a bag full of sweeties. "A fan, are you?" He nodded, smiling as best he could. "Well then, you know my quirk a bit. I fixed you up best I could, but you really do have to be more careful." "Yes, ma'am." He looked down at his bandaged hands, trying to hide his rage under the guise of shame. She sighed a bit before apparently deciding not to berate him. "Now, I'm not saying what you did wasn't heroic. I appreciate you saving that girl. I've always said this exam is too dangerous, but that doesn't mean you can break your limbs like that." He nods, feeling a bit better now that he knew there seemed to be at least one reasonable and competent adult in the world. "Now, dear, I'm going to need you to be very careful heading home. I healed you, but your bones were shattered, and you have to be very careful with yourself for at least a few days. Also, you need to take it easy. My quirk uses your stamina to heal injuries. If you keep getting hurt like that, it will kill you. Also, please learn to not break your limbs with your quirk." She smiles at him before handing him more sweets, as though she hadn't just told him that his bones were shattered, and that her quirk could kill someone. But Izuku reins himself in, nods, and thanks her before hobbling home, trying not to, but also failing miserably at not focusing on how angry he is, and how much his limbs ache. And for the first time since he started his training, he decides to take the train home instead of walking. When he gets home, his mother is there by the door, anxiously wringing her hands and acting as though she hadn't just been anxiously waiting for him to get home. Ever since he had come home, bruised and bloodied after the slime villain incident, she had been far more nervous than usual. She acted as though she didn't even really want him to leave the house. And although Izuku loved his mother more than anything in the world, and knew she meant well, he couldn't help the rage that bubbled up within him, knowing that she didn't believe in him in the slightest. It hurt to see how little faith she had. Before he had left, she had said she would be proud of him for just trying, but anyone could tell that meant she expected him to fail. The worst part of it all was that he had failed. He had met her expectations with vim and vigor. Not only had he failed at getting into UA, but he had also gotten hurt, which meant his mother had been right to not believe in him. All her worry and doubt had been completely founded. There was nothing to do for it now, though, and it wouldn't be fair to act cranky at her. So Izuku let his mother fret over him, and pity him, and cook him his favorite for dinner. even though what he really wanted to do was scream at the top of his lungs and burn the world. But that just wasn't an option at this time, so he let himself be comforted, and found himself both relishing in her comfort and growing all the more discontented by it. It had been a week since Izuku had failed the entrance exam, and each day saw him more and more furious. Not because he had lost hope. No. He had made a vow to himself to see his goals materialized, and this was only a setback in the end. The entrance exam for Shiksu was the next week, and although he doubted his results would be much different, he had no plans on stopping there. Worse come to worse, he was applying for a general studies course at every hero academy that allowed upward mobility. So although failing the exam for UA was certainly upsetting, it wasn't the main source of his anger at the moment. The thing that was steadily making his temper rise was the fact that he hadn't received a single word from All Might. The man who was supposed to be his mentor hadn't so much as sent a single text message his way. Hadn't inquired about the exam. Hadn't asked after him. Not a peep. And in this modern age, how fucking hard was it to send off a quick text? Izuku could tell you. It was an insanely small amount of effort. But once again, there was nothing Izuku could do. He had painted himself into a corner when it came to All Might. The boy that All Might had been teaching simply wouldn't have the guts to text his mentor. Especially not after a failure. The ruse Izuku had built up to keep up his position as All Might's successor was a boy who in no way, shape, or form could ever even think of questioning his hero. Even if it meant accepting complete radio silence from the man. So Izuku was trapped. And angry. Because it honestly made no sense. Even if the man decided to not train Izuku anymore, Izuku still had his quirk. He had asked about it, and unless Izuku gave it away, there were no take-backs. Even now he could feel it buzzing under his skin, all that energy just waiting to be released. But he had other things to worry about. For one, his letter from UA would be arriving today, which would just tell him he'd failed the practical. He only cared that it was coming at all because he was holding out hope that his test scores were good enough for the general course. And then in the middle of his reps with the barbell he heard a thud, and then there was his mother. She was laying on the floor, apparently having run full speed to his room, without taking into account the slippery floors, and she was holding out a letter from UA. He of course checked that she was all right before asking for a moment of privacy to read it over. She left him alone, although he felt bad for causing her so much stress. And so it was because his mother was waiting to hear the news that he opened the letter without any hesitation. But inside was a silver disc, and before he could react to that strange reveal, there was All Might. Well, a projection of him. Izuku was so shocked by this sudden development, he actually forgot to listen for a moment. The reason I am in town is I have come to teach at UA. And well, if that isn't a shock. All Might then goes on to explain that while he didn't get enough points to pass the exam, he was also graded on rescue points. Which honestly he hadn't even considered. But that meant he was placed squarely in 6th place in the entire exam. He couldn't believe his ears, and could barely pay attention to the rest of the video. He felt a certain level of disconnect from the situation. He was so shocked by the results, he actually had to have his mom watch the video with him to confirm that he wasn't misunderstanding anything. But the fact remained. He had actually done it. He had made it into UA. His mother cried and told him she was proud, and Izuku felt the tiniest amount of his pain drip away. He had made it into UA. And this was only the beginning. Izuku allowed himself the first genuine smile he'd had since he had fought the slime villain. This was only the first step in his ambitions. But for now, he couldn't wait to see the look on Bakugo's face. Seeing Bakugo's face upon finding out that Izuku had passed the entrance exam wasn't quite as satisfying as he had hoped. Not to say it hadn't been hilarious, of course, but he really could have done without the whole being shoved against a wall thing. Surprisingly enough, being bodily thrown into a brick wall wasn't the most comfortable thing to have happen. So the satisfaction of telling Bakugo wasn't as good as it could have been. But he was sick of being walked all over. He was going to be a hero, and if Bakugo thought he could still intimidate Izuku into submission, he had another thing coming. So even though the first part of their interaction was a bit disappointing, the truly satisfying part came next. It came when Izuku let himself do what he had been wanting to do for longer than he would admit to himself. And he headbutted Bakugo hard. Bakugo dropped him in shock as they both reeled from the collision. Given that he had expected and initiated it, Izuku recovered first, and in an astounding feat of role reversal, he was suddenly holding Bakugo up by his collar. Despite the fact that Izuku knew there was no way he could win in an all-out fight, He really only needed 𝗵𝘃𝗀 to stay still long enough to say his piece. I earned this. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 looked at him in shock, nose bleeding slightly. I was told I could be a hero, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. 𝗵𝘃𝗀 seemed frozen in place after his declaration, which was good enough for him. So Izuku walked away, head held high in triumph, and with 𝗵𝘃𝗀's nose bleeding. Another victory for him. After that day, 𝗵𝘃𝗀 ignored him as though nothing had happened. It was like Izuku didn't exist. And honestly, that worked just fine for him. He was too busy to worry about 𝗵𝘃𝗀's moods at the moment. The second and less satisfying conclusion to his many strifes was his meeting with All Might. He had gotten a text to meet at the beach the night after he got his letter from Yua. Which wasn't surprising considering the man was a teacher at there. He probably knew when he'd get the letter. It made sense in a way. With All Might being a teacher at UA, he'd probably wanted to keep his new position a secret as long as possible, even from Izuku. Which Izuku could understand to some degree. Didn't mean he wasn't still pissed about the radio silence though. So even though he technically understood why he'd been ignored, he was still fuming a bit as he approached the beach. He did his best to school his features into something more affectionate as he approached the #1 hero, waving with a nervous-looking smile as he approached the giant of a man. Even without all the muscles, he was still about 7 feet tall. All Might offered him his congratulations on passing his exam, and then explained what Izuku had already kind of understood about his quirk. Basically, it was too powerful for him, but his limbs had also exploded partially because he had no experience with it. From then on, All Might had basically tried to offer a platitude and rudimentary explanation of his quirk, as well as a vague promise that he would master it with time. But honestly, there was no way in hell Izuku was gonna let that shit slide. Not when he'd almost died. Not when his limbs had been shattered. Not when every dream and ambition he had was riding on this quirk. Not when he was going to be attending Yua. And most importantly, not when he had finally gotten a taste of winning. All Might was going to teach him how to use his damn quirk, or so help him. Well, so help him if he couldn't figure out a way to try and effectively tell All Might what to do without actually telling the man what to do. Hey, All Might. He looked down at the ground, trying for all he was worth to act nervous, which in a way he was. Yes, my boy. All Might looked down at him curiously. It was rare that he started a conversation or continued it after All Might was done. He normally simply waiting for All Might to talk. And All Might had been finished. It's just that. I know it will take time for my body to get used to One for All, but if I'm going to be your successor, I need to be able to use it. He looked up, letting tears form in his eyes as he looked wide-eyed up at his surprised mentor. And All Might, I can't attend Yua. I can't learn to be a hero. I can't do anything if I keep breaking myself. I don't really understand your quirk at this point. I think, if I want to be someone who's worthy of being your successor, I need more help. I need you to properly teach me how to use One for All. I need to be better. I want to prove that you made the right choice by picking me. He finished his speech strong, looking his hero in his bright blue eyes. Knowing that all things considered, it was a pretty good speech, and more importantly properly within range of the personality he had presented to All Might thus far. All Might coughed out a spray of blood. Midoriya, my boy. He began shifting into his muscle form and clapping a huge hand on his shoulder, his smile growing brighter. You're completely right. I have, perhaps, not been living up to my responsibilities as your teacher. But I will make up for that from now on. I will draw up another training routine to further strengthen you. And when school starts, I will do my best to clear additional training with Nezu after classes. I promise I will get you properly trained. All Might offered him a blinding smile. Izuku offering up a teary-eyed one in return. Plus ultra. He threw a fist into the air. All Might joining him. Izuku felt a lot better. His little gambit, it seemed, was going to pay off nicely. He would finally be able to work on using his quirk, and he would have a new training routine to mess with. Training with All Might and final exams made his life a whirlwind of activity. The only other thing of note that had happened was when his teachers and principal congratulated him and 𝗵𝘃𝗀 on their UA acceptance. And that was only notable because it had made him so angry. And before he knew it, it was his first day of UA. He'd decided to forsake applying for the other schools he's been eyeing once he had been accepted into UA. Although he was a bit disappointed since he had kind of wanted to look more into Shiksu High School. But that would probably be weird. After all Might would probably wonder why his successor would choose a school he didn't work at. By this time him and his mother had long since talked about the mysterious emergence of his quirk, and it seemed that she was ready to support his dreams now. Although her sudden belief in his dreams bothered him, he tried not to dwell on it, and he was sent off to his first day with a tearful goodbye. Luckily for him, he had a lot of time to collect his thoughts and emotions before class started. It was a long walk to 𝐬𝐻 from his house, but he couldn't complain. After all, it was a beautiful day. Originally, he'd wanted to jog to school since running was still a huge part of his new training regiment that he had been given. But if he ran there, he would get his new uniform all sweaty, so that was a no-go. Which meant he would just have to leave extra early. At first he had thought he'd given himself too much extra time. But once he arrived at 𝐬𝐻, he was glad he had given himself plenty of extra time to get there, because finding his classes seemed to be going to be a struggle. 𝐬𝐻 was just too giant, and designed very much like a maze. By the time he found his way to the giant classroom doors, he only had a few minutes before class started. Honestly, it was any wonder he found Class 1A at all. Well, actually he hadn't found it himself. He'd had to resort to asking a cute third year for directions, which actually resulted in said third year panicking and asking a different cute third year if he knew. And that many cute upperclassmen all trying to help him just wasn't good for his heart. But it was all okay now because he had finally located his classroom, and man was that door giant. Before he could properly wonder at the insane largeness of the doors in front of him, he heard the telltale noise of Bakugo shouting from inside. And wasn't that just his fucking luck? He stood there weighing the pros and cons of catching or avoiding Bakugo's attention, when he had a sudden realization. All Might was only going to be teaching one of his classes. And other than him, the only person in this whole school who knew anything about him was Bakugo. Which meant he could act however he wanted. No one had any expectations. As long as he didn't actually speak his mind, he could act however he wanted. He was free from expectation. This fresh start might not seem like a very big deal to someone else, but Izuku had spent his whole childhood and middle school years as Deku. He had been a laughingstock, a stuttering, quirkless mess. But now he was no one. He would of course still have to act a little bit starstruck with All Might. But other than that, he could be whoever he wanted. He could finally act like Izuku Midoriya. Bakugo might call him Deku, but Deku was gone. He was going to be Izuku Midoriya, and he knew exactly who he wanted that person to be. So he walked into the classroom standing tall. Even when he felt people's eyes naturally drawn to the movement, he stood tall. Well, as tall as a short person could stand. He even allowed himself the small pleasure of smirking a bit when he met Bakugo's eyes before picking a spot in the back nearest the door and sitting down. It was the first time he hadn't snuck into a classroom since he was 5 years old. His short victory and quiet was interrupted by a familiar face. The girl he'd saved at the entrance exam was approaching his desk smiling. "Ah, it's you. That plain-looking boy. Seriously plain. Should he be insulted? Was she trying to fight?" He decided not to start off non-defensive. She didn't look angry or anything. "Oh, hi. I'm glad to see you got in too. I was worried when that rubble fell on you. Thanks for speaking on my behalf." He tried for a normal smile, which was almost difficult given how often his smiles were shaky. "Huh, how'd you know about that?" She rubbed the back of her neck, laughing a bit like she was embarrassed. "Weird. Oh, you were in my acceptance video. Apparently, there are cameras everywhere. Which is a little creepy. Anyways, thanks for speaking on my behalf. I'll look forward to having class with you." "Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Anyways, I'm really glad you got in too. I guess we're doing our entrance ceremony and stuff today, huh?" Before Izuku could respond, or properly reflect on how he was having one of the first friendly conversations he'd ever had with someone his age, there was a giant caterpillar on the floor by their door. "If you came here to make friends, then you might as well get out. This is the hero course." The thing that turned out to be a person stood up out of his sleeping bag. Izuku, for his part, decided it would be best to just sit quietly and watch how this all played out. The man, who was probably their homeroom teacher, looked around the classroom with a tired glare before speaking again. "It took all of you 8 seconds to quiet down. That just won't do. I'm Aizawa Shouta, your homeroom teacher. Now change into your gym clothes. We're going to be doing some tests outside. Anyone who takes too long will be expelled." Before he could walk out, the girl from the entrance exam called out, "Wait, aren't we supposed to go to the entrance ceremony?" Izuku winced a bit when he saw the unamused glare his teacher gave her as he paused his exit from the room. "𝐬𝐻 isn't like other schools. I have a lot more freedom as a teacher in my teaching methods. If you all want to become heroes, you can't waste time on frivolous things like entrance ceremonies. Instead, we're going to be doing tests to determine if you're wasting your time or not. He pauses to look around the room and make sure everyone was listening. Now hurry up and go. And honestly, you didn't have to tell Izuku twice. He would have gone without the speech. He hurried along with the rest of his class, changing quicker than he ever had before, and then practically running out to the training field. He was actually the first out there, which, although he was relieved about at first, was actually terrible, because for about 30 seconds, it was just him standing there with his homeroom teacher standing in awkward silence. Or at least awkward for Izuku. His teacher couldn't seem to care less. Plus, he really didn't like that his P uniform had his arms out. He had worked very hard to hide his burn scars from people. He didn't like suddenly showing weakness to people he didn't even know. Aizawa started speaking when everybody else had arrived. A very short boy with weird balls on his head being the last to walk out. In middle school, you all participated in any number of physical tests. For them, you weren't allowed to utilize your quirks. That will not be the case today. You will be performing these tests using your quirks. He produced a ball from his pocket, throwing it toward Bakugo. Throw this using your quirk, and let's see what you're capable of. Bakugo smiled like a wolf with a rabbit in its teeth. Sweet. His throw was punctuated by a huge explosion, and shouting before their teacher held out a distance tracking machine. This is what you're capable of with your quirks, he said, holding out the machine with the huge number. His eyes darkened. But if you think the heroics course is just going to be fun and games, you're sorely mistaken. So as added incentive, whoever comes in last will be expelled. He grinned out at the class as people yelled in shock and protest, with Izuku starting to think he should have applied somewhere else. After all, he'd rather face expulsion than willingly shatter his arms and legs. And it would be embarrassing to get expelled so early in the year. Izuku sighed as he stretched, feeling a bit resigned as he lined up for the foot race. He would just have to accept the very real possibility that he would be leaving UA today. The best he could do was put his maximum effort into each challenge and hope it was enough. Who knows, there might be someone who didn't have a suitable quirk for this stuff. For the first challenge, he did okay. His training had made him a lot faster and stronger than an average 15-year-old. But it was a little bit discouraging when at least one person really shined during each of the challenges. Even the tiny guy had done well in the sidestep test. But there was nothing to be done for it. So he resolved to just stay calm and take any expulsions with as much grace as he could muster. He would figure out what to do when the time came. After a few more of the challenges came the ball toss. He briefly considered the possibility of using his quirk. He really didn't want to embarrass himself by getting expelled. But he also hadn't known this quirk would explode his limbs when he signed up for this whole thing. So he would just throw it as hard as he could. He had spent all his free time lugging refrigerators off of dumpster beaches. He could throw a ball. Izuku threw it, shrugging a bit when he saw that it had only gone a mildly impressive distance. He wondered briefly if they'd simply let him transfer to the general course instead of expelling him. Then he could master his quirk there and try and transfer in later. He was in the middle of thinking about logistics when his thoughts were interrupted. I erased your quirk, I saw, his teacher said, threateningly, stepping forward with his glowing red eyes. What? Aizawa blinked at him, looking a little bit thrown. And then it clicked. Oh, you're Eraserhead. You saved my mom from a mugging one time. He bowed respectfully before pausing to actually consider what his teacher was saying. Also, I wasn't using my quirk. Aizawa blinked at him again. Apparently, this wasn't how he thought his was going to go. They stared at each other for a minute, both trying to figure the other out. Although Izuku was more excited to actually meet a hero who he still respected than he was interested in parsing the situation. After he had become disenchanted, most heroes had simply lost their appeal for him. Not Eraserhead, though. After another minute of staring, as though Aizawa was debating all the things he had been about to say before Izuku had interrupted him, he seemed to make up his mind. All right then, he seemed to be about to let it go, but then he got that scary look on his face again. You know, I saw your entrance exam. And apparently you have enough common sense to know your quirk makes you useless after saving one person. So how do you think you can become a hero like this? You're either not saving people, or you're being a burden by getting hurt. The stare Aizawa was leveling him was almost enough to make him regress into old habits again. But he got the feeling that cowering wasn't exactly what the situation called for. It was still too early to know what the proper approach to this guy was, but he thought it might help to show some spine. You're right, he forced himself to make eye contact. But I'll figure out how to use it. and I will become a hero. There's nothing anyone can do to stop me." His teacher seemed to consider him a bit more before shrugging and calling the last few people to do the ball pitch. And then the next few events passed. More and more people getting their chance to shine. But now with the added level of horribleness that was people wondering about his weird talk with the teacher and why he wasn't using his quirk. The only really exciting thing was when he had tied for first in the push-up test. Apparently him and a few other students had really good stamina, and Aizawa had decided to just call it a tie after a few minutes. But soon enough all the tests were done. He thought he had actually probably done good enough to not be dead last. After all, some people's quirks weren't suited for most of the challenges. But he was still a bit nervous when Aizawa announced they were done. "Okay everybody, let's look at your results." And with that Aizawa clicked on a holo projector, "Where did Yua get the money for this stuff?" and displayed their results. Momo Yayurazu. Shoto Todoroki Katsuki, Bakugo Tenya Ida Fumikage Takoyami Mizo Shoji. Ochako Uraraka Mina Ashido Rikido Sato Tsuyu Asui Mashirao Oijuru. Ijiru Kirishima Hantasiro Koji Koda, Izuku Midoriya Kaiyu Kajiru. Yuga Aoyama Denki Kaminari Toru. Hagakure Minoru Mineta Izuku stared up at the holographic display, unable to believe what he was seeing. He wasn't last. He was so relieved he thought for a moment he might collapse. Not only had he not placed dead last, but he had beat 5 people who were using their quirks. And he hadn't used All Might's quirk at all. He had taken the rest while being effectively quirkless. It made him both happy and angry to realize that he was actually stronger than a bunch of people with quirks. Because while it was extremely vindicating to know he could beat up the cream of the crop for future heroes without using a quirk, it was also infuriating that he had been told all his life he would never be good enough, when here he was, being good enough. But it still wasn't enough, he reminded himself. Even if he could beat a bunch of wannabe heroes, the world would never have let him become a hero without a quirk. He would never have been good enough. This was the only way. This just meant he would have to work even harder, and then crush the hero system into dust. He paused in his musings. That last bit may have been a little bit dark. He was reforming, not crushing. Keep it together, Izuku. He took a deep breath. One of these days, he would really have to work on reining in his destructive thoughts. It was one thing to be fueled by rage. It was another thing entirely to have villainous thoughts. Their homeroom teacher sighed and looked at the screen before zeroing in on the tiny boy who had placed last. "Minoru Mineta, not only did you place last, but you have not demonstrated any motivation or drive to succeed. And if that weren't enough, I have already received a complaint that you tried to grope one of your classmates. You're expelled. Please grab your things and report to the principal's office." Around Izuku, the whole class lost their shit. Not really out of any upset about Mineta in particular, but just that it wasn't even their first official day here, and someone had already been expelled. Izuku observed that it seemed like everybody had something to say about it, most of which seemed to be revolving around the fact that they had thought he was lying about expulsion, or just general shock and fear. To be honest, he found it kind of annoying. Izuku already knew you couldn't trust authority figures. They never actually cared about their students. Aizawa didn't want to waste his time teaching useless students, and that was just fine with him. He was never going to be called useless ever again. Plus, it seemed like almost everybody but Izuku had forgotten that Aizawa had specifically said that he was going to expel the person that placed last. He would admit it was stressful, but this was the hero course, and life was anything but fair. As far as he was concerned, they were lucky Aizawa had given them a heads up on his plans. Honestly, the most stressful part of this whole thing was watching everyone lose their composure about it. He felt more worried that they would get in trouble for kicking up a fuss than anything else. Well, not everyone was kicking up a fuss. The classmate with white and red hair was looking on stone-faced at the whole situation too. After everyone had calmed down, and they were dismissed for the day, they all made their way to the locker room to change and head home. After all, today was only supposed to be the entrance ceremony. Actual classes would start tomorrow, so they were free to go. Aizawa Shoto was tired. This was always true to some degree. There was pretty much never a time when he was fully rested. In fact, it was impossible for him to be with his schedule, especially during the school year when he worked as a pro hero at night, and then had to grade papers and work on lesson plans, and then go to class. He was lucky if he managed to get 6 hours and broken up naps through the night and day. It was once in a blue moon that he got a concentrated amount of sleep, let alone 8 hours. But this was just ridiculous. It was only the first day, and although he didn't feel bad about it really, dealing with a student expulsion was never fun. And worse, he had also had to deal with All Might. And he just didn't like the man. Or at least, he hated what he represented. However, the true reason behind his new extreme tiredness was from one of his new students. And that student was Izuku Midoriya. He had thought that he had his students figured out going in. Most of them had good quirks, and with enough gumption they could work through the problems they had, whether it be a lack of confidence, or too much confidence, or whatever else. As long as they didn't have zero potential, he would do his best to help them become good heroes. And he thought he had a pretty good handle on the kind of people they were, especially Midoriya. He had looked like a burnout from the beginning. He had only gotten 6 villain points, and had been acting nervous all throughout his exam. But then he had shown off his quirk, and Aizawa had been impressed. For all about 2 seconds before he saw what his quirk had done to the kid. Hell, if the kid had almost died in the entrance exam, there was no way he was going to make it in the hero course. And worse was that All Might had an eye on him. The man tried to hide his fondness for the boy, but it was obvious they had some kind of connection. He had even heard that All Might asked for room to specially train the kid after school. And even if he had any doubts about this connection, it was destroyed when he spied the man hiding behind a building and watching the tests like a girl in an anime, working up the nerve to talk to her crush. Not that he'd ever watched anything like that. But then Midoriya had been different than he expected. Since All Might had singled him out, he'd expected him to be reckless and excitable, but watching him. The best word he had for Midoriya would probably be pragmatic. He didn't use his quirk even though he was facing expulsion, and he hadn't seemed surprised or worried about his classmate getting expelled. And something about it just didn't sit right about the way he looked at people. It was like he wasn't watching people somehow, like he was lost in thought. And that wasn't even considering the scars littering his arms. The worst part of this situation was that he felt like he needed to know more information. And that meant walking past the annoying hero standing behind the building. He took a moment after everyone had started heading to the locker rooms. Mayta having already left for the principal's office, he had been crying, although no one seemed especially set on comforting him. Before walking over to the hero. "It's good to know you have so much free time you can waste it like this," he began, not being able to resist a little barb. "Ah, Aizawa, I see you only expelled one student today. Which means you see all of these others' potential." All Might gave him a wide smile. "Get to the point, All Might. You're wondering about Midoriya, aren't you?" He knows it's a bit risky to just bring it up out of the blue, but they obviously have a connection, and he doesn't like to waste time. "Ah, well, of course I see young Midoriya's potential. He's an enthusiastic and kind boy." All Might lets out a nervous, wet-sounding cough. "Why do you ask about him specifically? Do you also see his potential?" He looks a bit excited. "Well, he doesn't have zero potential. Otherwise I'd cut him loose. And it's true, I was wondering about him." All Might looks positively ecstatic. "What kind of person do you think he is?" Honestly, normally, he wouldn't bother with this sort of thing. After all, asking All Might his opinion wasn't something he really wanted to do. But he's learned over the years that you should always trust your instincts. And his say something about the kid is off. So might as well hear what All Might's impression of him was. What sort of person he is. All Might rubs his chin as though deep in thought. He's a bit reckless, but he cares about others, and I would say wants to save people more than anything. He's a bit panicky and quick to cry, as well as being an uncontrollable fanboy. But he is a hard worker, and he is sure to make a great hero someday. Why do you ask? No reason really. Aizawa walked away, not feeling great about the situation. Either he'd misread Midoriya's personality, or All Might had. Or something else was going on entirely. And he wished it wasn't so. But he was going to have to keep an eye on the kid. After all, the kid All Might was describing was very different from the cold, practical boy Aizawa had met. Izuku was feeling pretty good, all things considered. He hadn't gotten expelled, which was always good. He had had a whole conversation with someone that hadn't ended in defeat or victory. And he was supposed to meet All Might to talk about training after he'd changed. So all in all, a pretty good day. Of course, he still had to change into his workout clothes and meet with All Might, so the day could still go badly. But best to stay positive. "Hey dude." Izuku jumped as someone approached him. Getting singled out in the locker room was never a good thing, and he didn't know who he could trust here. "Oh, hello." And there he was, slipping into old habits. "Hi, I'm Kirishima. What's your name?" The boy in question held his hand, which Izuku took. I just wanted to say hi. I was kind of wondering what your quirk was since I didn't really see you use it. Also, I was wondering why you weren't changing into your uniform. But mostly I thought it would be good to say hello since we're going to be classmates. And wow, if that wasn't a lot to take in. In this one day, Izuku had been talked to more by his classmates than he had in almost his whole middle school career. He wasn't counting taunts and bullying as talking. Izuku gave what he would classify as a charmingly nervous smile. Best to act at least a little bit sweet. Even if Kirishima seemed nice, he would never trust someone approaching him in a locker room. I'm Izuku Midoriya. He looked up through his lashes at the boy. And yes, you're right, I didn't use my quirk. It has some unfortunate side effects. As for why I'm not changing into my uniform, I do training after school. And I also look forward to being classmates. He finished with as bright a smile as he could muster. Oh man, training after school, that's so manly, Kirishima said, holding a fist to his chest, blushing just a little bit. What? Manly? Oh, thank you, Kirishima. Okay, what was he supposed to do now? Well, I should probably head out now, my trainer will be waiting. Oh, yeah, sure. I'll see you tomorrow. It took him a little while to find All Might, which was kind of unfortunate, because looking for him meant that he was wandering around the school in workout clothes. But he eventually found the pro hero, who had also apparently been looking for him. Ah, young Midoriya, I'm glad I found you. I explained the situation to Nezu, and he has set aside an area for us to work on your training for a few hours until you can work out how to use your quirk. Thank you, All Might. The room they found themselves in was large, with some exercise equipment in the corners and some mats laid out. Now I know we haven't had a lot of time to talk about it, but to start out with, I wanted to know how it felt to use one for all. Well, I did what you said about clenching your butt and shouting with your heart, and it worked. It was like I was filled with an amazing amount of energy, and then my limbs were broken. That part was really unpleasant, Well, I think the first part to your training will be figuring out how to regulate your power output. Your body is strong enough to hold the power, but I think at this point you should try to only use some of it. All Might seem to think for a moment before continuing. Which means we need a way for you to connect to your power. For me, it came naturally, so once you figure it out, you should be able to figure it out easier from there. Okay? That was a lot to take in. Let me think about that for a minute. So basically, I need to think about this power as something that can be used in different percentages of power. And as a quirk that's part of my body, I should be able to feel it like a muscle or something. When All Might uses it, his whole body becomes stronger, so does it move through my body like blood. If so, that would make sense that too much of my power was in my arms at once, causing it to explode outward. So I need to figure out how to control the output of power, so it doesn't break me. Like a hose with too much water or something. Okay, I think my first step should be to try and hold a bit of power to get a feel for it. Sounds like a wonderful plan, my boy, All Might replied, holding a thumbs up. It took him a moment to feel out one for all and coax it into his muscles. It took almost all of his concentration to keep it flowing through every part of his body. It took even longer than that to feel like he might be able to move, but then something clicked. It was like his body had finally connected to the power. It was only a tiny percentage of it, any more than he was taking right now, and he was pretty sure his limbs would explode again. But he had found it. All Might, I think I figured it out. This time he didn't have to force the happy tears or joy into his voice, as he realized he could use this quirk. All Might smiled brightly, his skeletal face looking nice with the genuine happiness he felt. I'm so glad. Now that you've figured out what it feels like to access one for all, let's try some exercises. What followed was one of the most intense training sessions of his entire life. If he had thought that training was hard quirkless, he was wrong. He had to put almost all of his concentration into keeping one for all evenly distributed and at a low enough power level that he wouldn't break. Then he had to keep it flowing while moving. And then embarrassingly, once he'd figured out all that, the first few times he tried to move, he wound up launching himself into the wall or ceiling, and also into All Might at one point. But all that didn't matter, he had it. After a few hours of training, he was a little bit worse for wear, covered in sweat, and barely able to move, but he could use it. He couldn't use it very well, but compared to how he had broken his limbs, this was amazing progress. And this was only the start. Now the fun could really begin. It was his second day of attending UA, and Izuku was already exhausted. First he had had to find his class, then he'd had to worry about getting expelled, then he'd found out his teacher was Eraserhead. Then he'd trained with All Might till he, quite literally, dropped. And then he'd had to go home and do his regular training, and talk to his mom. All of this made him exhausted, especially having to end it all by talking to his mom. It wasn't that he didn't love his mother and want to talk to her. It's just that he was already tired, and she was hard to be around sometimes. They loved each other, and she was a sweet person. But it was tiring to have to act like nothing was wrong. To have to pretend to be someone he wasn't anymore, even at home. He had to pretend her lack of belief in him hadn't broken his heart, and that her belief after he had gained a quirk hadn't broken it even more. He had to act like it didn't hurt him that she didn't notice anything was wrong. Had to act like he wasn't angry at her, because she honestly didn't deserve his anger. She was all by herself, and even though she should have known, he had never outright told him what was wrong. And she'd had to work full-time and raise him all on her own. And he, in his heart of hearts, she would do anything for him. So he was tired as he walked to his second day of UA. On the bright side, the walk was good for letting him collect his thoughts. The weather was nice again, and it was calming. As well as that, he'd gone to bed ridiculously early so his body had time to recover from the hell he'd put it through. But he was emotionally exhausted, and he had a feeling that today was going to be even more tiring. But he just had to stay positive. As he approached the school, he heard someone shouting, and it took him a moment to actually pay attention to see what it was about. And he realized quite unexpectedly, it was at him. "Hey Deku," shouted a friendly voice. Izuku froze. He had thought he was free. But as he turned slowly around, he saw 𝐬𝐬 waving and jogging toward him saying that horrible nickname. No one was supposed to know. His heart stopped for a moment before it was suddenly flooded with rage. How had she even found out about that stupid name? For a moment he thought he was going to strangle her, right there in front of UA. She faltered a bit when he turned toward her. His face must have looked unpleasant. It took him a second to school his features into neutrality, as she approached more slowly now, only offering up a weak smile and wave. "Hey, Deku, don't call me that." She flinched a little bit at his tone. "Sorry. I thought it was a nickname. I heard that guy calling you that yesterday. And I thought it was like Deku. You know, like I can do it." She held her fist into the air, a bit as though in victory. Although her smile was strained, he relaxed a bit. "No, it's an insult that Bakugo calls me. It means useless, and I don't want to be called that." She deflated a bit, looking guilty, and he felt a little bit bad for wanting to choke her out a second ago. He just wasn't used to someone being rude to him turning out to be a misunderstanding. "Sorry, I won't call you that." "It's fine." He gave her the nicest smile he could. "It was just a misunderstanding." She smiled back at him, blushing slightly, and looking pleased that they had come to an understanding. They walked to class together, holding a nice casual conversation, almost as nothing had never happened. Their first few classes were somewhat boring. They just had normal core courses until their foundational heroics class. And even then it was mostly just introductions, and then light lessons to start them off. Honestly, after yesterday it was just boring. The only thing that had happened of any particular note was that Present Mike seemed to take a liking to him. As far as Izuku could tell, simply because he was the only one to respond to his call and response. He didn't do it with vigor. He simply calmly responded when Present Mike had done it. Guy really liked call and response. And he'd only really responded on a whim. He felt bad for the guy after the first time. No one had said anything back, leaving everybody to hang in silence. And it wasn't like he had to go all out. Simply talking back in a normal voice was enough to get the pro hero hyped up. Actually, one other interesting thing had happened. Lunch. For the first time since elementary school, people had wanted to sit with him. As pathetic as it was, he'd mostly eaten in classrooms or outside during almost his whole school career. So he'd been cautiously optimistic when 𝐬𝐬 had asked him to sit with her at lunch. It had wound up being him and 𝐬𝐬, joined by Iida, who he thought was a bit uptight, and Kirishima, who he couldn't understand very well, as well as some of Kirishima's friends who he hadn't learned the names of yet. And after that it was just more classes. Until it was time for foundational heroics, which started with All Might entering the room like a total weirdo. Izuku found himself wanting to cringe at the man's weird entrance. But upon hearing the gasps of delight from his classmates, he remembered himself and acted suitably starstruck. If all went according to plan, he would be acting starstruck toward All Might for a very long time. Just thinking about it made him lose some of the stars in his eyes. Yes, the man was the #1 hero, but he wished he wasn't so awkward sometimes. All Might explained that they would be suiting up in their costumes for their exercise, and Izuku sighed a bit. His mother had made his costume for him in a show of love. And although he honestly really appreciated the gesture, it was based on designs he'd had as a kid, and didn't really suit the person he wanted to become. Of course, that wasn't to say he didn't love that she did that for him, especially when she apologized for not believing in him before. It was an act of love, and just like many of his other interactions with his mother, he bore it with both appreciation and dread. So he decided he would wear the costume. But it was just normal material, and he worried that the under armor and padding the support department had given him wouldn't be enough to protect him, even in class exercises. But on the bright side, since it was so fragile, he figured he could just get an upgraded version when this one got damaged. Probably without the All Might hair spikes. He really appreciated it. But this was not what he would have picked for himself. But soon all that didn't matter because everyone was in their costumes, and they were about to have their first training exercise. Izuku was both nervous and excited. He was nervous because he still didn't have the best control over his quirk. But he was also excited because he could use his quirk. And honestly, he couldn't wait for Bakugo to find out. It was going to be hilarious, and also probably dangerous. But if Bakugo randomly attacked him, he might get expelled. And that would be pretty great. Enough with those thoughts though. He had to pay attention to their instructions. Today we'll be doing a heroes versus villains exercise. The whole class gasped in excitement and burst out with questions before All Might held up a hand to quiet them, and then held out a small cheat sheet. Izuku fought the need to facepalm. Most truly dangerous villains are found indoors, so for this exercise you will be split up in teams of 2. 1 hero and 1 villain. The villain team will be guarding a bomb, and the hero team will be tasked with retrieving the bomb. The hero team can win by capturing the villains or the bomb, and the villain team can win by securing the bomb till end of the round or capturing the hero team. Everyone started talking amongst themselves excitedly and asking questions. All Might began looking a bit nervous at all the questions being so suddenly slammed into him. Now everybody. We'll be drawing teams and pairings by lots, so just calm down. Also, unfortunately, since you have an uneven amount of people in your class, someone will be on their own. And if Izuku hadn't thought the class was riled up before, watching All Might become overwhelmed by all of the students again made Izuku feel kinda bad for him. So he decided to step in and explain that heroes should train for the unexpected, and basically get the class back on track, yada yada yada. And then All Might drew their teams, and for the second day in a row, he once again wished he had just stayed home. Round 1 villain team, Bakugo Katsuki and Iida Tenya vs. Hero team, Izuku Midoriya. Honestly, fuck his life. Sure, with a team he could figure out a way to win against Bakugo, or at least not be utterly obliterated, but on his own, there was almost zero chance of him walking away from this unscathed. And there was no way All Might would let him switch with anyone. All Might would probably think that Izuku was happy to face his childhood rival, or some bullshit like that. As he stood there oblivious to the world around him, he could feel his thoughts speed up and get away from him. All centered around the fact that he would be facing Bakugo by himself. And now he was spiraling. Calm down, Izuku. Think. Okay, he was still spiraling. When had All Might finished announcing teams? He was startled out of his reverie by a hand being gently placed on his shoulder. And there was Uraraka looking at him with warm brown eyes lit with concern. Hey Midoriya, are you feeling okay? You seem kinda spaced out. He did his best to present a warm smile. She was turning out to be a really nice person. Yeah, thanks Uraraka. I'm just a little bit nervous is all. Before he knew it, it was time for the first round, his round. And he did not feel great about it. He had a vague plan. Avoid Bakugo, who would be gunning for him, sneak through the building, and then sneak up on Iida and grab the bomb without either of them noticing. Easy. But how was he supposed to get through the building without alerting either of them to his presence? His mind spun around with possibilities for a while before he suddenly had it. He wouldn't go through the building. He would climb it. And so it was once he had a semi-workable plan that the timer went off to signal the start of the match. He started moving as soon as it rang, and began to scale the building. It was difficult work, but the gloves he'd gotten from the support department were grippy as he requested, and after concentrating for a moment, he was able to use one for all to increase his strength to better scale the building. Only problem was he had no idea what room the bomb was hidden in, which meant he would just have to start from the top and work his way down. As soon as he made his way into the building via window, he had his second great idea of the day. If he wasn't limiting himself to traditional means of approach, why shouldn't he do the same in here? Once he found Ida, he could go through the ceiling. If he could figure out where Ida and the bomb were, he could crawl the panels and come out on top of the bomb without there being any need to fight. But first he had to find Ida. Unfortunately for him, it seemed that if there was any god out there, it hated him. Because after he'd snuck around the building and found Ida, and right before he was about to climb his way into the ceiling and to victory, 𝐲𝐽 found him. And he honestly looked more angry than Izuku had ever seen him. And weirdly enough, before he'd recognized that he'd found Izuku, he'd been very quiet, as though he'd been sneaking around. Izuku hadn't thought he could sneak. But as soon as he saw Izuku pulling up the floor to crawl into it, his face shifted from calm into complete fury. "Deku!" he shouted, already running toward him. As Izuku saw his plans fall to ruin, he did the only sensible thing he could think of, and ran like hell in the other direction. His plans were ruined. The best he could do was avoid a premature cremation. After all, it wasn't like All Might would expel him for failing. "Deku, stop running and fight me!" 𝐲𝐽 yelled, somehow keeping pace. It seemed like he had no choice. As the old saying goes, if you can't run from him, beat him. Before Izuku turned to face 𝐲𝐽, he powered up one for all to give himself a moment to power up. Noticing out of the corner of his eye how green lightning patterns zigzagged across the outside of his suit. When he turned to face his tormentor, he saw 𝐲𝐽 frozen in his tracks at the sight of it. "What the hell is that?" he sounded almost breathless. "It's my quirk, 𝐲𝐽." 𝐲𝐽 flinched, although whether it was at the usage of his last name or the fact that Izuku seemed to have a quirk was unclear. After the flinch, his face remained blank as he took in this new information. He didn't even seem to be breathing. And then it was over, and he once again shifted back into rage, although this time he somehow seemed even angrier than before. "So it's true then, you've been looking down on me this whole time, hiding your quirk. Well, that ends today. Fucking fight me." Katsuki charges him as Izuku gets in a fighting stance. He's seen 𝐲𝐽 use before. Feet wide, arms up. And it's only then that Izuku realizes that he knows how 𝐲𝐽 fights. The right hook coming for him is one he's seen hundreds of times. He's spent his whole life watching 𝐲𝐽. And now it was time to put that to use. So when 𝐲𝐽's hit is about to land, Izuku grabs his arm in mid-swing, pivots and flings 𝐲𝐽 over onto his back and into the ground. The earth almost seems to stop spinning for a moment as the dust settles, 𝐲𝐽 gasping for breath from the quirk-enhanced throw, and Izuku standing over him. Izuku pauses for a moment, adrenaline streaming through his body in tandem with One for All. And he feels so good. He knows it's wrong, but he loves hurting 𝐲𝐽. Simply looking down at the gasping boy fills him with something akin to ecstasy. But that was his first mistake. The moment he took to leer down at 𝐲𝐽, mouth stretched into one of his rare genuine smiles, had given 𝐲𝐽 enough time to catch back his breath. Which meant that when 𝐲𝐽 jumped back up to his feet seconds later, setting off an explosion in Izuku's direction, Izuku was forced to surrender the upper hand. Not only that, but the explosion had singed the side of his mask, forcing him to tear it off his head before his whole mask caught fire. He made a note to not let his love and appreciation for his mother get in the way of safety again. 𝐲𝐽 snarled as he reappraised his enemy. Izuku simply resumed his fighting stance, wrapping a measure of his capture tape around his hands, waiting for 𝐲𝐽 to strike again. They stared at each other for a moment before 𝐲𝐽 decided to make the first move again. Starting with a different punch. Izuku was barely able to dodge the blow, even with his small percentage of One for All. They continued on like this for a minute or two, 𝐲𝐽 sending devastating blow after devastating blow, with Izuku barely able to parry or block them. Occasionally sending a punch or kick 𝐲𝐽's way, which would force him to catch his breath for a moment and allow Izuku to regroup. It was brutal. But Izuku found himself loving every second. Too engrossed in the battle to bother suppressing the manic smile he knew must be plastered on his face for all to see. He hadn't felt this good since the slime villain incident. Then after an especially harsh exchange of blows, 𝐲𝐽 held one arm out and grinned. "These gauntlets were made for me by the support department. They store my sweat as I fight. So I'm sure you can guess what will happen when I pull this pin." 𝐲𝐽's face spilt into a giant wolfish grin, as Izuku's eyes widened in disbelief. He thought he vaguely heard All Might shouting at 𝐲𝐽 not to use it, and 𝐲𝐽's grunted-out reply that it wouldn't kill him if he dodged. The amount of flames that came out of 𝐲𝐽's gauntlet were unbelievable, But thankfully Izuku was able to dodge at the last minute, only to see 𝗵𝘃𝐻 leap through the dissipating flames. Izuku barely managed to catch the fist looking to knock him out, but the force of their collision knocked both of them painfully onto the ground. And in that moment Izuku lost his tenuous hold over One for All. But the hits just kept coming, both of them seeming to be growing exhausted. Then Izuku made his second mistake. They found themselves in between blows, when 𝗵𝘃𝐻 apparently decided it was time to launch his grenade at Izuku again, probably to buy more time for a sneak attack again. This time All Might didn't even bother telling him not to. After all, Izuku had dodged the first time. But then the unthinkable happened. He didn't dodge. The first time he'd barely managed to escape the flames, and that had been with All Might's quirk activated. And since then he had lost his tenuous control over it. And although he might have been able to make it out of the way, as he moved to lunge to the side, he tripped on a piece of rubble, and instead of dodging out of the flame's path, he fell to the ground on the edge of the blast radius, giving him only enough time to see the flames coming toward him. And then there was only pain. The explosion that hit the left side of his body was the single most painful thing he'd ever experienced. He could feel every nerve cry out as it was being burned away. He couldn't even scream out, because the fire consumed the air in his lungs. And Midoriya Izuku burned, and burned, and burned. Then, after what felt like an eternity of pain, he found his consciousness fading into black. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 looked across the destroyed room at the burnt-up body of Midoriya Izuku. He couldn't wrap his brain around what had just happened. He didn't understand how their fight had led to this. Less than a minute ago they'd been fighting, and it had been so satisfying. He'd never had to think or react that fast in his life. For each punch or kick he'd thrown, Deku had been there with one of his own. They were perfectly matched. Sure, he had been angry. Fucking Deku had been lying to him their whole lives, mocking and humiliating him by keeping his mouth shut about his quirk. But during the fight that had seemed to melt away, and it was just them again, on equal footing, he had found himself having fun. It felt like in fighting, they could understand each other more than they ever could with simple words. But then Katsuki had ruined it. And it didn't matter that they were finally on equal footing again. Didn't matter that it was just supposed to be a training exercise. Because Deku hadn't gotten out of the way. It didn't make sense. The first time he'd set off his grenade, Deku had gotten out of the way easily. It wasn't supposed to hit. But it didn't matter what had happened the first time. Because the second time he hadn't dodged. He'd seen the look on Izuku's face in the moment, when he'd seen the giant wall of flames heading straight for him. And now the whole world was standing still, seemingly holding its breath, while Katsuki stared at the burnt-up form of Midoriya Izuku. He'd done this. How could he have done this? Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the world resumed. And he rushed forward as quickly as he could, almost falling as he rushed to get up, landing hard on his knees in front of the boy who he'd once called his best friend. But once he had gotten to Izuku, he didn't know what to do. His hands hovered uselessly above him, shaking. He didn't know first aid. He had no way of aiding him, didn't even want to check for a pulse in case he hurt him further. All his life, he'd only bothered with thinking about how to hurt people. He'd wanted to be a hero to win. It had never been his goal to save people. He'd never considered learning how to heal things. He tried saying Izuku's name, somehow hoping he might open his eyes and be fine again. That he would somehow not be terribly injured by Katsuki's own hands. That somehow Izuku would sit up on his own, and smile and everything would be okay. Or he'd wake up and find this had all been a terrible dream he could forget about in the morning. Moments later, All Might burst into the room they were in, finding 𝗵𝘃𝐻 still hovering over Izuku uselessly. It was the only time 𝗵𝘃𝐻 had ever seen All Might's face without the signature grin. The one that told you everything would be okay, and Katsuki broke. If All Might wasn't smiling, it meant that there was a reason to fear. "Please help him," he pleaded, voice breaking and tears he hadn't known he'd been holding back spilling down his face. All Might nodded and kneeled before Izuku, picking him gingerly up off the ground, making sure not to exacerbate his wounds as he ran as fast as he dared to Recovery Girl's office, leaving 𝗵𝘃𝐻 in the ruins that he'd created. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 sat in shock for a moment longer before making up his mind and running toward the nurse's office. 𝐬𝐻 was a tired man. It was only the second day of school this year, but he already seemed to have a lot of problem children to worry about. But on the bright side, he was off the hook for foundational heroics today, leaving him with some time to work on lesson plans. although it was less than ideal that All Might was teaching it. He knew that the man meant well, but he worried about his ability to teach. But he figured that if All Might proved to be terrible at his job, they could simply have another teacher shadow him. Either way, for now he was looking forward to the possibility of a nap after work. That is, he had been until he saw none other than Bakugo Katsuki, one of his most problematic students, running past him in the hallway. And in his hero costume, no less, looking like he'd gone through a severe beating up. In the moments that Aizawa saw him running past, he saw that the boy was not only limping, but he was also covered in ash and blood. And if the way one arm held his side said anything, he might also have a cracked or broken rib. Seeing one of his students running like that through the hallways set Aizawa instantly on high alert. He let the boy go free, although not before he imparted his instructions to the boy. When you get there, stay outside of the nurse's office. I'll go check on your classmates. His voice left no room for arguments. Yeah, he seemed really messed up. He was literally covered head to toe in bandages. So I told him to go and rest. Several people, including Uraraka, had their mouths fall open in shock. You mean he did what you said? I mean, yeah. The whole class stared at him in open-mouthed shock. Their teacher was scarily intimidating, and the idea that he'd done something because a student had told him to was an insane thing to consider. Especially since it was Midoriya. But before anyone could say anything else about it, Present Mike burst into the room. Even without his quirk, his voice was amazingly loud. Can I get a hey? He shouted, arms in the air, as he burst into the classroom. Izuku lifted an arm slightly off his desk. Hey. That's the right attitude, listener, he yelled, pointing at Izuku, and then speaking in an almost normal voice. So I'm subbing in for our dear Aizawa, who, as you all know, was injured. Now he's doing fine, but it was decided kind of last minute that he should have a substitute. So here I am. Present Mike walked over to the desk before continuing. Anyways, I only really have one announcement before we start your normal class and homeroom stuff. And that's the sports festival, which you all will need to prepare for, since it is in 2 weeks. At this, the whole classroom broke into excited shouts and questions. Izuku laid his chin on his arms, looking up disinterested. Honestly, he was happy to mostly tune out his classmates. He was still kind of tired, and his class was a lot. Present Mike was also a lot, even though Izuku liked him well enough. The rest of homeroom passed by boringly enough, although Present Mike ran a much louder class than Aizawa. Izuku mostly just laid there staring blankly. He was still kind of ahead of the rest of the class, and he felt like he didn't really need to know anything about the sports festival. Everyone in Japan knew how it worked. He would train, and then he'd crush anyone who got in his way. It would be fine. When the bell rang, Present Mike wrapped up whatever it was he'd been talking about, and Izuku got up to head out. Uraraka walked up to his desk, her hands bunched into fists as she stood in a powerful stance, her eyes burning brighter than he'd ever seen. She took a deep breath before looking him square in the eye. Midoriya. The sports festival. Let's do our best. Her voice was so determined and intense Izuku could feel his spine straightening despite himself as he took her in. Her energy stoked a fire within him, and he felt that familiar ember within him erupt into a raging flame, although somehow with far less anger. And without really thinking, he had already grabbed her fists in his own and mirrored her determined gaze. Let's do our best. Any other time, they both probably would have felt awkward at the fact that they were clasping hands in front of the whole class. But as it was, they were too caught up in a mutual blaze of determination. They stood there for a moment longer, staring into each other's eyes before nodding in sync and letting go of each other, and then determinedly power walking toward the door. Their next class was spent much calmer than they ended homeroom. Boring monotony of their classes simmering down their determination. Izuku from boredom and Uraraka from having to stop thinking about the sports festival enough to pay attention to lessons. But then at lunch, as they walked together, their determination and fire returned. Their friends following steadily behind as they power walked to the lunchroom. Midoriya. Izuku looked over at Uraraka as she spoke, eyes gleaming as brightly as hers. We're going to win the sports festival. I expect to see you in the finals. Izuku nodded. I expect to see you too. They nodded in sync again before walking even more determinedly. ________. Uraraka and Izuku's friends were still a bit wary from what they'd seen at the USG, especially Tsuyu, who had been the closest when it had happened. Especially because even though no one would say it, Izuku was honestly mostly Uraraka's friend. It wasn't that most of them didn't like him, but he tended to make people a bit uncomfortable. He had been gone for a long time after the incident with Bakugo, and had come back a little bit more obviously off. Although to be honest, he'd already seemed weird. But he seemed intense in a way no one really knew what to do with. One minute, he would be this friendly, nervously adorable mess, and the next he would get a look in his eye, as though he was dissecting you. And worse, that he'd found you wanting. At the moment, it was hard to be wary of Midoriya though. Not when he was being so weird with Uraraka. They were so determined after the sports festival announcement, it was actually kind of funny. Especially when they were power walking ahead of their group, looking like they were walking into a battleground. Despite the fact that they were just walking to lunch. This image of Izuku acting sweet and weird was so at odds with the terrifying force of nature they had seen or heard about at the USG. Mina and Kaminari hadn't even been there, but they had heard what happened. Everyone had. A monster had shown up that had strength to rival All Might. And then Izuku came out of literally nowhere, and ripped its spine and brain out, and then scared away the villains. The two versions simply didn't fit together. Well, it fit with half of him. He was either harmless or distinctly not. And everything he did seemed to fit squarely into one of the two. Depending on when you met him, you would get a completely different impression of him. And it was hard to tell which was true, which set them all a bit on edge. Except for Uraraka, it seemed. She seemed determined to be friends with him. But no one was exactly willing to bring it up with him or Uraraka. The boy had gone through a lot since the beginning of the year. First, he'd been horribly injured and scarred, and then they had been attacked by villains. It was a lot. And Uraraka was not the type of person to take kindly to talking about someone behind their back. Before they could get to the lunch hall, All Might peeked around a corner quite unexpectedly. "Midoriya, would you mind joining me for lunch?" All Might held up an adorable bento box, and Uraraka was so shocked that she almost choked on laughter. Midoriya's face was carefully blank for a moment before his face broke into a sweet-looking excited smile. "Sure." He turned to all of them and waved. "I'll see you in class." And with that, him and All Might walked away. Toshinori was not looking forward to this talk. Ever since the incident, he hadn't been able to face his young successor. He let the boy down. He'd simply wanted to be a hero. Toshinori was supposed to protect him. But instead, he'd failed him. Had them do an advanced combat exercise without teaching them enough beforehand. Had failed to stop Bakugo from using his grenades. Not once but twice. And all for some sick sense of pride. He had thought there was something odd about the two boys' interactions, had sensed some kind of tension between the two of them. And he had selfishly wanted his successor to get a chance to work things out. Wanted to vicariously show off Izuku's skills. The boy still struggled with One for All more than he ever had. But he was also making so many strides of progress. But none of that mattered because he had messed up. Let his pride get in the way, and Midoriya had suffered for it. Was still suffering for it. Toshinori's mistakes would follow both of those boys for the rest of their lives. He'd gotten a chance to talk to young Bakugo, and he had been horribly traumatized by it all. Saying he deserved to be expelled or jailed. And to add insult to injury, Toshinori had been a coward further. He realized belatedly that he hadn't even talked to his successor since it happened. Had been afraid. Afraid of confronting the boy. Afraid of fully facing the consequences of his actions. What if he didn't want to keep One for All? What if he would never forgive Toshinori? Or worse, what if he did forgive him? And then the 𝐴𝐻 had happened. He was supposed to be there. But instead, he'd stupidly wasted his time. And endangered everyone. Had needed saving. Forced Midoriya into thinking he had no choice but to save him. His gloomy thoughts were interrupted by the fact that they had reached one of the teachers' lounges. After all, in a school like UA, there was honestly more teachers' lounges than may be actually necessary, which meant they would thankfully have some privacy for this meeting. He led Midoriya into the lounge, and his heart squeezed unpleasantly when he saw the boy's mild-mannered expression as he looked up at him curiously. The fact that he wasn't being yelled at or looked at with reproach the way he deserved made him feel sick to what little remained of his stomach, especially when he saw the huge burn scar that marred the boy's face. Because of Recovery Girl, it looked better than it had any right to. But it was still harsh on the boy's face. He cleared his throat a bit after transforming back, glad he was spared the embarrassment of spewing blood everywhere when he did. He gestured to the couch and meanered to the electric kettle. "Can I get you a drink?" Midoriya smiled placidly at him. Toshinori's guts twisted. "Sure. Any tea would be fine." Toshinori stalled while making the tea, trying to organize his thoughts, although it seemed like a futile effort considering he'd been trying to think of a way to approach the boy since the incident. And now, with what had happened at the 𝐴𝐻, and what had happened after, he could hardly keep his thoughts straight. He remembered his conversation with Naomasa in Recovery Girl's office, but shook off thoughts of that strange conversation when the kettle began to whistle. He hurriedly made the tea before returning to Midoriya, who had politely been sitting there this whole time. He smiled at his as he took his tea. "Thank you, All Might." Toshinori cleared his throat, although this time he was unlucky enough to choke out a bit of blood too, but quickly collected himself before standing up once again, and then bowing low. "Young Midoriya, I am so sorry for what happened to you. It was completely my fault. And not only that, I should have done a better job protecting you. Not just during the training exercise, but at the 𝐴𝐻 as well. I should have done a better job of protecting you all. I swear that if you will have me as your teacher, I won't let you down again. Toshinori stayed bowing as he waited for the boy to reply. He could feel a single bead of sweat trail down his back as the boy collected his thoughts. He had after all dumped a lot on him. Especially since the boy was so awkward. Toshinori suddenly worried that he might not even feel comfortable enough to tell him how he really felt about the situation. Once again his thoughts were interrupted as young Midoriya cleared his throat. You should sit back down, he said not unkindly. I forgive you. Midoriya clenched his hands together. Honestly, I was more worried than anything when you didn't contact me. Toshinori's heart split in two. But the boy continued. I was worried you were disappointed in me. But you should know that the 𝐻𝐸 wasn't your fault. The villains were at fault, not you. I do see why you could blame yourself. But if you'd like to make it up to me, I'd like you to make me a promise. Toshinori nodded fervently. Yes, anything. Please don't disappear again. I still want to be a hero. And I can't do that without you. So please, if anything happens like this again, don't just disappear on me again. The boy stared into Toshinori's eyes in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. But he was too relieved to mind. Here he was completely in the wrong, and yet being offered absolution. Being promised that all young Midoriya needed from him was for him to stay around. He was filled with an intense mixture of guilt and relief. He nodded. Of course, I promise. Midoriya smiled that winning smile of his that seemed to light up the room before taking a sip of his tea. This is very good, thank you. The rest of the lunch was spent pleasantly. Toshinori couldn't bear to put any pressure on Midoriya about the sports festival after all that. So they simply spent the rest of the lunch talking about mundane things. He asked how classes were going, how his mother was doing, if he'd been making in friends, and ended it all by saying he was proud of him and would see him at training after class. Midoriya left with a pleasant smile and little wave before heading to his next class. Toshinori still felt anxious about the whole thing, and he doubted he would ever be able to easily move past his feelings of guilt. But Midoriya was a good boy, and his forgiveness had set his mind slightly at ease, although his conversation with Namasa still bothered him a little bit. He'd been laying in the hospital bed in Recovery Girl's office when his old friend had come in to check on him. After their usual niceties, the man had said something odd. You know the boy who took out the Namu? Toshinori nodded. Well, he was understandably shaken up about the whole thing. But I feel like there's more to it than that. What do you mean by that? The other man rubbed the back of his neck with his hand. Well, this is going to sound strange, but you know how my quirk works. And he was almost completely truthful. But he did lie to me a bit. And even when he didn't outright lie, it felt like he was hiding something. Like his behavior was off. And not only that, but according to the reports, I'm getting the way he disposed of that Namu was downright brutal. I'm not saying he was wrong to do it. He saved your life. But I wouldn't expect that kind of behavior from a student. Toshinori thought for a moment about what he knew about the boy before answering. Thought about the slime villain incident, how Midoriya had ripped the villain's eye out with a smile. But then he also thought about the boy himself. How much he loved heroes, how he was quick to cry and stutter, and how he had a truly kind heart and wanted to save people. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Like you said, he was probably just shaken up. I know Midoriya, and he's a very good young man. What happened today was awful, and he may have been hiding something, but I doubt it was anything serious. Izuku walked back to class feeling drained. He had had to spend his whole lunch with a man he was starting to really hate, and pretend that he didn't. It was exhausting. But the fact of the matter was that he needed All Might. At least for now. On the bright side, he had gotten a well-deserved apology, and he would be getting proper training again, which would be essential if he wanted to win in the sports festival. Izuku promised himself it would be worth it in the end. Promised himself he would make his goals become reality. When he got to class, he felt a little bit better. Something about Uraraka's fiery attitude made something in him burn too, and it felt nice to feel so determined. Soon enough the day was over as the bell rang on their 6th period. He and Uraraka were the first to the door, mostly because it was such a strongly ingrained habit to try and escape class as quickly as possible. But the sight on the other side of the door was truly shocking. Outside, there was a veritable sea of UA students, all crowded outside their classroom, all looking over curiously as they opened the door. Izuku and Uraraka froze in shock mid-sentence about training regimes as they took in the crowd. Ida, who had been following behind them, the closest, was the first to speak, hands already chopping through the air. "What is everybody doing out here? It is a fire hazard to block exits." Izuku was too busy wanting to disappear in order to properly appreciate the humor of Ida being most concerned about fire hazards in such a weird situation. Yaoyorozu was the next to step forward. "Hello. What are all of you doing outside of our classroom?" Her voice was mild, but authoritative as she scanned the large crowd the same way their homeroom teacher did sometimes. Izuku was impressed. She was really coming into her own. At that question, a boy burst out of the crowd dramatically yelling. His hair was silver, and he had sharp teeth and sharp hair. His most defining characteristic, Izuku thought, though, was probably his eyelashes, which were giant and fluffy, almost like a moth's fuzzy antennae. They looked very soft and went all the way up past his eyebrows. "We came to see the class that survived the villain attack, to make sure you all aren't going to embarrass Class 1B during the sports festival." A few people nodded in agreement with him. Yaoyorozu hummed thoughtfully before putting a finger to her chin. "So you all basically came to scope out the competition for the sports festival?" At that, another person separates from the crowd. The first impression Izuku gets is that he is ridiculously tall, and that his hair is also really tall. His second impression is that he looks dead on his feet. His dark eye circles rival Izuku's, and although he's really tall, he seems to be made out of skin and bone, and he's kind of slouchy. It's true, a lot of us came to scope out the competition. But did you know there's one thing that makes the sports festival special? And that's that this is the only time when the people from other programs can be transferred into the hero course. His face splits into a grin, and vice versa. The class is quietly shocked as they take in this new information when the boy pauses. He keeps smirking as they do before his grin widens further and speaks again. "So consider this an official declaration of war." The class seems like it's having a hard time deciding between nervousness and excitement at this declaration. But Izuku is mostly annoyed, although he does his best to keep his face neutral. Yaoyorozu recovers first and clears her throat to get everybody's attention. "As class president, I believe I speak for everyone when I say that we accept your challenge." She breaks out into a smile of her own. "Now, my vice president was right. This is a fire hazard, so I would ask you all to clear the way. I'm sure a lot of us have trains and buses to catch." The boy returns her smile before leaving the way he'd come. Izuku feels really proud of Yaoyorozu. She has really come into her role as class president, and had handled that masterfully, especially with how she handled Ida. He's not sure when she figured it out, but a lot of the time, he really only needs the things he says to be acknowledged in order to calm down. Izuku shoulders through the too slowly dispersing crowd. He feels like he's wasted enough time today, and he has training to get to, which will probably be hell.